I hit go live anyway. So let's see if should we cover it again just in case, or should we just move on? Uh,
Up to you. I'm good with whatever. I'm
well,
easy. I'm not picky.
I don't want to wear out your patience, my guy. You know.
It's very hard to wear out my patience. It's very, very hard.
All right, I'll take you up on that then. Let's go over it just again, just in case, and I can always edit it. If we're repeating ourselves, I can always edit it out.
Sounds good.
All right.
Besides, I'll probably be less awkward the second time I go through it. So
same. Don't worry. All right. So today we're going to be going over the Oppy versus Loke debate that was hosted on Capturing Christianity. This was a really fun debate. It covered the Kalam Cosmological Argument, which is, one of the brand spanking new inventions in philosophy of religion, and it's been pretty big for a while. And it's popular enough that non-philosophers will often know this argument. So that's pretty cool. Anyway, the debate is, obviously it has Oppy and Loke, and they're both, Oppy is very well known, and Loke is getting more and more well known because of his media appearances and his new book that's going to be coming out. So it's a pretty interesting debate. I have a guest, Logos, that's going to be helping me commentate. I found him in the YouTube comments, made some great criticisms. And so I thought I had to bring him on and share his thoughts. So now let's see. Mr. Logos, I guess you can do an introduction again if you'd like. Otherwise, we can move into our thoughts in general about the debate.
Quick intro. I'm Logos. I'm the crazy guy that stalks the Capturing Christianity YouTube section, always starting some mischief. And I went on a giant rant that basically broke the YouTube character limit twice. And my host here liked what he saw, and so here I am. These things are fun. I always wanted to do one, so happy to be here.
Awesome. So let's see. Why don't you give me your quick general thoughts on the debate again, and then we'll move into some of your points about the first argument. So
yes. So as a general performance evaluation, my bias on the table before I start, I've actually conversed with Loke personally before. It did not go very well. So I have that bias going into this discussion. I wouldn't tribally consider myself an atheist, so I don't have any bias for Oppy. And so if Oppy were to discuss with, say, someone like Proust or even Rasmussen or something like that, Kuhns, I could see it going either way. I don't really think I have an implicit bias there, but definitely my bias is against Loke, given what I've seen from him and given what we're about to see Oppy go through in the discussion is reminiscent of my discussion experience with him. So what we're going to see later is, Oppy goes through great pains to iron out his worldview, the initial states necessary, here's some things about it, and so on. And Loke will continuously miss a point, continuously misrepresent Oppy's worldview. Oppy will ask Loke questions about his worldview. Let's give this timeless state some extension. So we're talking about some there. It's not temporal, maybe it's causal. We can put something there which gives it something real to talk about. Loke repeatedly kept trying to accuse Oppy of saying he's talking about time, things like that, which got Oppy pretty frazzled, which many members of the audience realized was uncharacteristic of Oppy. Like, I don't know how many discussions members of the audience might have seen with Oppy, but you can watch him discuss with Kuhns or Craig or Rasmussen or Fezer, and he's got a pretty limited emotional range. He's a very reserved, shy guy. He will smile and raise an eyebrow if he thinks he's got you, but usually he's kind of a reserved fellow. And this one, I will say I've seen much more of Oppy's emotional range than I'd ever seen in any other discussion with Oppy. Featuring Oppy, and Loke is the denominator there. I'll say that when I first heard about this discussion, I didn't even know how productive it was going to be given my own experience with Loke, and it ended basically the way I thought it was going to end before I even decided to watch it. So that's my thoughts.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say that Oppy was pretty formative in my metaphysical understanding of the implications of naturalism. So he's had an influence on me, and I have somewhat of a bias towards him. That said, you know, I think the things that we're going to be discussing in this argument are going to hopefully not present any bias towards one or the other. This is, I mean, I guess ultimately we're giving our opinions, so it's inescapable that there's going to be some, and I think that regardless, there's like legitimate criticisms that can be made of I guess both, depending on your position. Although, like I said, I think that this debate uh, is going to be overall better for Oppy than it is for Loke. And if you want to see um, a debate in which Oppy has quite a bit of trouble, then Logos and I both agree that the Rob Coons debate that he has on Majesty of Reason is probably the one to go to. So anyway, yeah, that's that. Let's get into the Kalam cosmological argument. So you want to dish out again your thoughts on it?
Yeah, sure. So there's going to be, we agreed there's two ways we can evaluate the argument. There's the way in which the two interlocutors might evaluate the argument and which might be the pinch points for their discussion. But there's also the general opinions we could have on the argument, and where other people who aren't present for the discussion might agree, disagree, and things of that nature. So I will comment a bit about all of them. And instead of trying to say knock it down because, say, I'm an atheist or something like that, I've tailored my analysis to be which premises could be controversial, not just by theists, but maybe even by other theists like Thomists or people like that, to show that some of the premises that Christians might think aren't very contentious turn out to be contentious even for other theists and people like that. So the first thing we can talk about is the Kalam principle. You might think, whatever begins to exist has a cause. I mean, that's really, really easy, right? But there are many different parallels that have the same intuition, but block different aspects of the argument. So a very common tactic I've seen, not just atheists like, say, Jack Angstrich and Josh and people in that Krillism neck of the woods make as kind of a what if thing. But I've also seen other theists do this that are more strict personalists that are uncomfortable with the idea of timeless God in the model. An alternative principle you could say is, whatever begins to exist has a cause for its beginning at some prior point in time. So if you're going to talk about causes of beginnings, there should be something before the beginning that's the cause. You don't have these weird these sans time loops and weird things that happen in this argument that they're uncomfortable with. And all the arguments Craig would make for this premise in terms of, houses don't just pop into being uncaused, things like that. Why aren't there violations all around? These parallel principles would account for those. It also turns out that they'd be just reserved enough to also block some of the things that Kalam wants to do. William Lane Craig addresses two of these, I think, in his Blackwell Companion article. And one he had a good response for. Another one, which was more akin to the one I'm talking about, I don't think he had the best response for. A big bulk of his response was something like, in the absence of defeaters for my principle still stands. But as Oppy's going to talk about with arguments, people come in here with preconceived notions and worldviews. It's not just enough to say that some premise or other or some principle or another isn't defeated. You have to convince the other person to drag along with you. So the Kalam principle here is a major point of contention. It's premise one, and depending on who the opponent is, the argument might be bogged down here for 2 hours, and that's the end of it. Oppy, not so much, because Oppy has enough overlap with the principle, and enough of it's fine with him that aside from the initial state, which they'll be talking about most of the time, he's happy to say that, given 99.9% of all the events in the causal history of what is, the principle's fine. And you'll only see disagreement come up during t equals 0, the one state, and that's where their conversational focus. So that's premise 1. The next controversial premise is going to be premise 2. And maybe not, yeah, in this slide. Perfect.
Oh,
a little hard to navigate here. There we go. So this one here, it turns out, isn't fully exhaustive because you can avoid a first cause without having an infinite regress. You could have an infinite number of points, so there's no first one, but you can do it without a regress. And a way you can do that is by looking at causal finitism from Proust's Necessary Existence. All causal finitism says, which solves like a big swath of paradoxes, is that any point in a causal chain has a finite causal history, i.e. there's only a finite number of nodes connecting to it on its causal graph. But if what you have is you have some sequence of sequences, and the sequences as bundles are independent from each other. So let's say something resets from one sequence to the next one, so there's no direct effect. You can actually have causal finitism standing just fine without having a first member of some causal history sequence. So that's one way you can get around that. I have a formal argument for inserting things called angels into the Grim Reaper paradox, whose job is to do just that, which will resolve the formal contradiction, but will not force you to have a finite number of Reapers or a finite index of some kind. And so that's one way you can do that. There's a similar thing for loops. So I have seen many people argue against premise 2, not just myself, but Alex Malpass discussed this with Loke, discussed this with Craig. So premise 2 is contentious among other people as well. And yeah, forgot what I was going to say about that. But oh yeah, that's what I was going to say. We conclude with Oppy is fine to just accept it, because on his view, there is a causal finite history of the natural world and all the things there are. And let's just go all the way back to the beginning, the initial state. So it's not contentious for Oppy. Again, given the right opponent for Loke, 2 hours could have just been arguing about this premise, as he actually has done with Alex Malpass. The next one that's contentious is premise 6. So since the first cause is the first, it must be uncaused. And this is where this is contentious even with other theistic models. So a Thomist might say you could have like a first physically in a sequence of causal historical events, and there might be something intrinsic to the first thing. So it's not like a cause backwards in time, but Thomists have this idea of intrinsic causes to things. So there's the cause of something's essence being instantiated as an existential object, the essence existence distinction, the Thomistic proof. You've got composite cause in the Neoplatonic proof. You've got hierarchical motions. So the thing being what it is and doing what it does requires that it have some series of motions that allow it to be. And those motions depend on actualizations of potentials, which go all the way down into the thing, which could result in a first cause of the thing being what it is, even if it's the first in this like historical causal chain. So you don't have to be an atheist to object to this premise. A Thomist could too, so other theists could too. So it's contentious all the way around. Let's see. The next one was premise 10.2. This was the other one I found that might be a real big point of contention. And while Oppy was happy to hand wave most of the other ones away and say there's enough there on our worldviews that we can just gloss over them, 10.2 is where we're going to see a big disagreement happen in the topic. So this idea that God has libertarian free will because he can keep himself from changing, right? He can stop himself from being in time and then decide to not stop himself from being in time. The whole way that's framed, it begs the question against Thomism, because under Thomism, God has no unactualized potency. So God would never suspend an action or a state of being of his in mere potentiality. It's impossible, right? God's actualized all potentials. So under Thomism, God's always timeless. This whole timeless to in time dual states discussion just wouldn't happen. For Oppy, the question comes down to what does the sans time state do, right? So this whole idea is God is popping out of a sans time state, and of course I'm bungling this because I'm being kind of colloquial at the beginning, into a time state simultaneous to creation. And the question is, well, is there any extensionality in the sans time state that we can discuss that in some real robust sense? Because when we talk about, sans time things, we have a conceptual way in which we'd say the word never, right? At no point in time did something happen. And so it turns out that if God never stopped himself from being, from changing, he was just always changing. That's one interpretation you could have of it. So this whole idea that God stopped himself from changing and then he changed, but he stopped himself sans time. Oppy's going to examine that with a magnifying glass and say, what's up with that? Talk to me about this timeless state. And that's where a big portion of their disagreement is going to hinge on. That's my prediction of all the stuff in this argument. When I first saw this, knowing what Oppy has about his worldview, 10-2 is like the battle.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. All right, then the only thing that I wanted to point out really quick, not because I agree with it, but because I think it's interesting, is that there are the two big proponents that go against the principle number one of the Kalam Cosmological Argument are going to be Richard Carrier and Wes Morriston, and well, I should say that they go against it on the grounds of the idea that nothing can pop into existence. So Wes Morriston is going to say something like, if we have a state of nothingness, what would prevent something from coming into being? It can't be nothing, right? Like nothingness doesn't have that power to do that. And so now that I think about it, I do actually think he wrote it down in a paper somewhere that I read. So I think Morriston does have a formalized rendition of it, of this argument, and then Richard Carrier has two that he keeps on his blog. One's just like a simple run through of it, and then the other is going to be a more rigorous examination of what it would mean for something to come into being without any cause, something coming from nothing. So yeah, that's the big thing. So now let's jump into the first part of the debate that I want to cover. Oppy is going to be giving out his ground rules here. He's going to be explaining how he conceives of arguing and its relation to worldviews or theory. So this is pretty important because it's going to really change how the debate goes down the line. So hopefully, tell me if you hear this.
When we have an argument and it's got some premises.
Can you hear it? Uh-oh. We're having
technical difficulties. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
There we go. Sorry, I tried to unmute my mic and it disconnected me from the thing. That's never happened before. That was bizarre. Yes, I can hear it.
All right. Perfect. I'll be on the watch for that then. Because it looks like I have to add you back in anytime if you disconnect. So that's good to know. All right.
So when we have an argument and it's got some premises and the conclusion is that God exists or that God doesn't exist, the question is, what needs to be done with respect to the premises in order for us to be any further down the track than we would have been if we just asserted the conclusion of the argument? Because it seems as though what happens is you just assert the premises of the argument when you present it, and we've just shifted our position slightly. Instead of saying God doesn't exist, game over, I say that whatever begins to exist has an explanation, and from that I can get to my conclusion. And so I say game over. It doesn't seem like I've made any more progress. So I'm...
All right. You want to kick that one off?
Absolutely, yeah. So if there is one criticism I could make about Oppy in these discussions. Sometimes he's a little modest in the points that he makes. His generalization here of what's going on is absolutely right, but in a sense, it could even be worse than that. So notice that not all theists like the Kalam Cosmological Argument. There are some Thomists that disagree. There are some, I would call them strict personalists that disagree. So even people that agree with the conclusion of the argument might not like the argument. Why is that? Because sometimes the premises have so much metaphysical baggage that getting over that hurdle is even harder than just accepting the conclusion. So what Oppy's describing here is kind of like a best case scenario, right? Where you made an argument, somebody else makes an argument or has a differing worldview, and you have a conversation and they're kind of like, well, we'll agree to disagree because neither of us are convincing the other. But in the case of the Kalam, it could actually be worse than that, where certain premises, like we talked about, are so contentious that stating the argument is even worse than just trying to convince somebody without context that God exists. So yeah, what Oppy said, but even more emphasis.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Oppy's game plan with how he goes into arguments is going to be that theory comes first, and then arguments are meant to either describe positions or they're meant to show internal inconsistencies. So the whole idea is that you have to levy arguments against someone else's worldview. If you and we're going to see that there's some like disconnect here because some of the premises in the argument don't really affect Oppy that much, so he can just be like, oh yeah, I'm fine with that because my worldview is such that this premise isn't contentious, and then others are going to be disagreements, and he's not going to be really presenting any arguments against some of the things that Loke is saying, because that's not going to be really how he conceives his arguments. He's going to say, you have to come to me and show me where the internal inconsistency is. And likewise I have to do to you, should we be arguing against the existence of God. But right now, here, we're talking about the Kalam. So, yeah. All right. Our next one is 1848. Where Loke is going to describe how he sees arguments.
Well, I'm going to present the premises, and if you disagree, then I want to know why you disagree, right? You have to offer reasons for why you disagree, and I'm going to offer reasons why they are true, right? So if I'm able to offer reasons why they are true, and you're not able to offer reasons why you disagree, then I think the premise is established in our discussion, and then we can move on, right?
All right, I'm pretty much kind of covered that, but let's see. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's something interesting going on here, where if you look at how Craig in the Blackwell Companion addresses, say, alternate Kalam principles, the person who gives an alternate Kalam principle would say, hey, here's my principle, here's some intuitions for why I hold it, here's things I'm trying to block, here's some reasons. But then Craig will say, well, look, in the absence of defeaters of my principle, it's fine. I'm just going to continue to hold my principle. Also, if you look at, say, Alvin Plantinga, the idea that now Alvin Plantinga describes kind of like a Christian epistemology, but I think you can generalize it, right? Where we have some kind of immediacy in our metaphysical experience or intuitions and how things just seem to be the way they are. And unless we can find some real problem with that intuition is going to come first. And that intuition isn't going to go away just because you don't have an objection on the spot to some argument you're being thrown at in a debate. Maybe you have to think about it a little bit. Maybe you'll never come up with an actual objection, but something about it seems so off, and you can give kind of intuitions and reasons and hear things that are, I think follow from that I disagree with or something like that. But there's all sorts of views, not even atheistic filibustering ones, but even from other Christian philosophers where they might disagree with with how you convince somebody under Loke's model of an argument. Rasmussen's another good example, right? So it could be that there's an intuition behind why somebody has a premise. And even if somebody doesn't have a defeater, there might be an intuition behind why they fail to accept, even if they can't reject a premise, but they're not on board because there's some intuition. And Rasmussen would say, let's see if we can tease out your intuition and explore it together, which I think is a much more healthy way of discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, like I said, Oppy sees this as arguments are predicated on theory. So the way that we're going to view arguments is contingent on the sort of theory that we've, or worldview that we've adopted. Like another way that we could describe this is ideology, right? Like what is our, what sort of ideological commitments do we have? And what those are is going to determine what sorts of arguments are going to be available to us and what arguments seem sound or reasonable. So I think that's really important. And I think Loke clearly doesn't see it that way. And I feel like there's like some sort of like hyper rationality maybe in this way of like conceiving of arguments. There's many a philosopher have said. I'm specifically thinking of Gramsci, where he argued that like if rationality and arguments really preceded like theory, then what we'd have is anytime someone bested you in an argument, right, you would have to change your worldview so as to match his, because the other person, just showed that you like that he has a better argument and it's way more rational to go on his side. But that doesn't happen, right, in real life. And so I think there's a sort of like a more like, first of all, practical description of reality if we adopt Oppy's sort of I don't know what to call it, like meta dialectic, like a strategy. I don't really know what to call it, but there's like a practical aspect to it, and then I think there's also just like an aspect in which it, I think, accurately describes the way people actually go about arguing. I don't know. I mean, do you agree?
I do, and I think there's a very simplistic example of this from long, long ago, right? I'm thinking of the story where somebody was describing the paradox of the arrow to Diogenes, and Diogenes just thinks about the argument he heard for a second, scratches his beard, gets up, and just walks across the room and just said, "You figure it out." Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So the force of the argument wasn't important. Diogenes just has an intuition that motion happens. And however this guy talked himself into thinking that motion couldn't be the case, Diogenes said, well, look, I mean, your argument's interesting. I don't know where it went wrong, but you kind of talked yourself into this mess. You figure it out. So.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think we're in agreement there. And cool. So now let's go to our next point. It's going to be here. So this Loke is going to be explaining the relevance of the causal principle for us.
Principle.
Yeah. So the relevance of the causal principle is that by putting the causal principle, I'm trying to show that the first cause has no beginning. That's the key, right? Because whatever begins to exist has a cause. If we accept the causal principle that whatever begins to exist has a cause, and this would imply that the first cause has no beginning, right? And so that is the relevance for our discussion.
All right. So that's his understanding of the causal principle.
Yes, and I have no comment on any technical issues or anything there. In my notes, I have kind of like a descriptive, a logical description of what's going on. So for the audience who doesn't have like a lot of practice with symbolic logic, when you hear the phrase, whatever begins to exist has a cause, here's how you can think about that real intuitively. Imagine a big circle. And in this circle, we label that, things that have causes. and then there's a little tiny circle inside the bigger circle, and we label that things that begin to exist. So everything in the blue circle, or sorry, the little circle, it's blue on my screen. Anything in the little circle is in the big circle. That's basically all the statement is saying. Anything that begins to exist has a cause. Now, there are two things that you can pop out of a statement like that. You can show that something is outside the big circle, and so it can't be in the little circle because the little circle is in the big circle. Or you can show that if something is in the little circle, it has to also be in the big circle because it contains the little circle. So from that, there are two valid positions that Oppy can go into with his causal principle. He can say that if something is uncaused, then it wouldn't have a beginning. He can also say that if something has a beginning, it does have a cause, which is exactly what the Kalam principle does say. So currently, insofar as what Oppy wants to say is, since God intuitively is uncaused, it's beginningless. God is beginningless. That's fine. That's a perfectly fair, rational, logical move. At this point, what I want to caution people to listen for, and this will have to do with the clip that I shared, is beware of Loke ever trying to make the claim that if something does not begin to exist, then it is uncaused. Because think about what I said with the big circle and little circle. The little circle does not exhaust the big circle. The Kalam principle is not talking about causal things, like all cause. He's just talking about a subset of causes. Now, if you have something without a beginning, it could still have a cause. Thomas Aquinas famously said that he didn't know whether the universe was actually eternal or whether it definitely had a beginning. He thought it might be outside the realm of human knowledge, such to answer that question. Whatever the case, on a Thomist model, the universe would still be caused. So there are other theistic positions where you can have things that are beginningless because they're time eternal, and yet still have causes, intrinsic, underlying, kind of foundational causes. So be very, very careful as we listen to these clips to make sure that that Loke does not say that beginningless things are uncaused. That's not true. He can't get there from his causal principle.
Beautiful. I have nothing else to add. I think that was excellent. I will be referring back to your circle idea, though, because we'll see that there's more we can do with that. But for now, let's go to this next point. All right, this one's a little bit of a long one. So Oppy is going to explain how explanation factors into his worldview, and then he's going to give his idea of the initial state.
That's a mistake.
So I wanted to say something about that premise, since I'm going to reject it, and then Andrew can say
Okay.
what he wants to say. Because this is where the kind of rubber hits the road, at least as far as our discussion goes. So I think that what we want is some sort of general principle, and my general principle is going to be that everything that occurs has an explanation, and everything that exists has an explanation. Has an explanation, not has a cause. Now, that means, now, what do I think there is? Well, I think that there's the natural universe. There's natural reality. We might as well pretend that it's just the universe in which we live. I mean, we can complicate the discussion by considering a range of hypotheses that might mean that natural reality is bigger than our universe, but that just introduces needless complexity. So let's pretend that natural reality is just our universe. And if we think about what it looks like, there's an initial event and an initial thing. The initial thing that exists is the universe, right? And the initial event we might think of as the universe is expanding. So at t equals 0, the universe exists and the universe is expanding. And that's that any initial event includes what's happening at t equals 0 and what exists at t equals 0. Now, according to me, what there is at t equals 0, so what's happening and what there is necessary. So the explanation of what's happening there and the explanation of what exists there is that it's necessary. It has to exist. It has to occur. Right? Everything else, setting aside what's happening at t equals 0, is explained causally. So there's nothing that happens subsequently that doesn't have a cause. So there's nothing that occurs subsequently that doesn't have a cause. There's nothing that exists subsequently that doesn't have a cause. The universe begins at t equals 0. T equals 0 is the origin point. It's the beginning of natural reality. Right? So there's what exists and what occurs at t equals 0 does not have a cause, but it has an explanation. And the more fundamental principle, the principle of sufficient reason, is couched in terms of explanation, not in terms of causes. Right? So I don't accept that whatever begins has a cause. I say whatever begins has an explanation, but it's only non-initial things. Whatever non-initial things exist and occur have causes. Right? So Andrew and I disagree about the kind of fundamental principle to appeal to at this point. So while I say there's just natural reality, he says there's more stuff. There's a God who causes the initial what there is at t equals 0, what happens and what exists at t equals 0, and also causes there to be t equals 0 as well. I guess is responsible for the existence of time as well. Okay, so that's the significance of, as I see it, of this premise, and it's the point where I just disagree with what Andrew says.
All right. So we have that.
So you've read more Oppy than I have. Would you like to go first and explain maybe how you interpret that based on his written work, maybe?
Sure. So Oppy is adopting a particular position here. Usually in his writing, he says, hey, I have a ton of positions I can hold with respect to the initial state. I could think it's contingent. I can think it's necessary. I can think there's an infinite regress. Right, and he usually wants to keep his options open. But if he's debating theists, he's going to say that the initial state is necessary. And the reason he's going to do that has to do with his broader ideas of simplicity and explanatory breadth and depth. He often wants to compare theoretical virtues. So he wants to understand your world or his opponent's worldview as a theory. And then he wants to compare those theories and say, which theory is the better one to hold based on the evidence we have. And when he says simplicity, he's going to be talking about like fundamental ontological objects or entities. And when he's talking about explanatory breadth and depth, he's going to be asking, what sorts of explanatory power does this theory offer with respect to this piece of evidence? And then how do we compare it to this? And that's pretty tough to do. So he doesn't, there's too much data to be analyzing on a case-by-case basis like that. But so he does say that people can come to different conclusions, that maybe, there's more explanatory breadth and depth offered by a theistic account as opposed to naturalist one. He's going to say that the naturalist is equivalent in terms of explanatory power with the theist account, but he wins on simplicity. So I'll probably have more to say about uncaused things after this next clip.
Gotcha. So before we move on, I got a question as somebody who
Sure.
hasn't read Oppy, but I've heard him kind of describe his worldview in several videos now, and there's something I just keep coming back to, and I think if he honed in on this point just a little bit more, it would dissolve some of the disagreements he's about to get into with Loke like instantly. So I'm going to talk about what I think entails from Oppy's model.
Mhm.
And I want you to tell me if you think this is fair or not, based on what Oppy has said.
Sure.
So Oppy says that you have the initial state at t equals 0, and he describes his account of modality as you have the actual world. And what you have is you have all the points along the causal history of the actual world, and the possible worlds are worlds that could differ at that point in the causal history from what actually occurred by chance or maybe some other mechanism. So the way I imagine it is you have this family tree where you have like the trunk of the tree, the center is all the stuff that's actually experienced along the causal history of the natural world. And each of the branches would be the possible states that might have been otherwise. And the question is, what happens as you asymptotically tend back toward the initial state? Well, Oppy seems to describe what happens or happened as events on the causal history, which means something had to have been the case. Causality has to happen, time has to happen. But at t equals 0 in Oppy's view, nothing's happened yet, so there's no causal history. So if you really think about what that means, what's actually going on here is you have, at the initial state, you have the suspended possibilities of all the things that could be in the future. And causal explanations. So you get to say things like, here is how causality is going to work when time moves forward. And maybe you might know that post hoc, like you see causality and then go back and say, now that I've seen what causality is going to look like, we could go back and say, here's how this was going to work in terms of causality, make statements like that. Or maybe because the first round of causality is random on Oppy's view, where he talks about, the fine-tuning constants might be tuned as part of the process itself, so you don't know what causality is going to look like. What you could say explanatorily is there will be some sort of causation, and there will be some randomness and some process stuff that's going to happen, so we don't know exactly what it's going to do, but there'll be something. And so you put that all together, what I'm seeing in the initial state is a bunch of is a suspension of possible states the world could be under possible causes that would make them so. And there's an explanation that one of them is going to be the case. Now, let's think about modal logic for a second, right? So if things are possible by S5, necessarily they're possible, right? Possibilities don't owe anything to anything else for their being possible. If something is conceivable, if something is in suspension, that suspension is sufficient. It's good enough. It's necessarily so. Now, that being said, then there are two ways in which you can get to the necessity of Oppy's initial state. The first way is the Leibnizian interpretation or intuition, where you go back to the causal history of contingent facts. There's some necessary explanation for the chain, and that necessary explanation is just so. It's the Leibnizian thing that ties it all together. But what I've been thinking about when I've been hearing Oppy and really thinking about his view is actually constructing the initial state's necessity from the implications of his model. So he doesn't have to go to Loke and just say, well, it just is necessary. What Oppy could, I think, be justified in saying is the initial state, nothing's happened yet. There's no causal history. So you have possibilities which are necessarily so under S5 in modal logic. And that's why they're necessary. Now, what that's going to do for us later in the discussion is Loke is going to try to argue why Oppy's initial state can't violate his Kalam principle. He's going to talk about any universes could crash into each other and things like that. But if I'm right about how one might interpret Oppy's model, Loke is committing a massive category error in the argument he's making. He fundamentally misunderstands the kind of thing the initial state is. So based on what I've said there and what you've read of Oppy, what do you think about that?
I think, if I'm understanding right, I think that Oppy would agree with that. And we'll see. I mean, so I want to start discussing Loke's criticisms because I feel like it's going to build into this explanation.
Oh, absolutely.
So how about we do that, because then I can give my uncaused beginning spiel.
Sure, let's do it.
All right. Let me see. So I'm skipping a little bit. What Loke is going to be trying to argue here, is that whatever begins to exist is brought about and constrained by the first cause. So something can't come to exist without a cause, because then he's going to say, like, if we have a house, right, we're going to ask, why is it a house as opposed to a pile of rocks? And we're going to say, there's a house builder. That was the cause of why it's a house. So then he's going to say, the cause is going to tell us why something is the case. And then he's going to try to make an argument that stuff is going to just start popping into existence. So here, I'll let him speak.
To elaborate on this argument, to make it more rigorous and to apply it to the beginning of the universe, we can phrase this argument like this, right? So if physical reality, right, if the whole universe, the entire space-time block, for example, if this is uncaused, then there will be no cause, which makes it the case that only this space-time block, only this physical reality, rather than other similar finite space-time blocks or other things with beginning within the block and having from beginning to exist uncaused, right? There will be no cause that makes it the case that only the universe begins to exist uncaused. And the properties of the universe and the properties of other things which differentiate within them will be had by them only when they had already existed, right? Moreover, the circumstances around us is compatible with those other things beginning to exist, right? So, for example, the circumstances around me is compatible with, say, electric field increasing in strength, right? And then, we know that other universes could also the fact that our universe exists doesn't mean that other universes cannot exist, right? So scientists speculate about multiple universes, right? So if our universe began to exist uncaused, other universe would also be could also begin to exist uncaused, and they would, because there will be no property that differentiate between them, right? Until after they had already begun to exist uncaused.
All right, come off here. So, I mean, I guess I can hand it to you if you want to speak first and say your thoughts, and then, or if you don't, I can go into mine.
Yeah, is this where you wanted to go into your spiel on uncaused things? Yeah, I'll let you do that first. All
right, so this is actually an argument that William Lane Craig has made before. And then prior to William Lane Craig, both Jonathan Edward and Arthur Pryor have also made this argument to some respect. So, and Oppy has actually discussed this about 10 years ago now. And him and William Lane Craig have had a little back and forth in the literature about this. So, if I want to reformulate the argument, it's going to be something like this. Like, hey, if your initial state can just pop into existence, what's stopping a tiger from popping into existence right now? And then the second question is going to be, if your initial state just pops into existence, why couldn't a rabbit be your initial state? So, William Lane Craig, in his other work, makes a distinction between logical possibility in terms of modality, and then like real alethic possibility. So the idea here is that we don't want to consider everything that's like conceivable when we're speaking in terms of modality, what is possible and what is necessary. Instead, there are certain things that are impossible, even though we can conceive of them being the case. And it seems like Oppy is taking up this sort of view. So he's going to say that it's manifestly impossible for a rabbit to be the for the rabbit to be the initial state of reality. And part of the reason you're going to say is because, rabbits are part of like a larger network of related entities. And then we also see that to be the case as well. That's really important. So he's going to say that the general point that he's trying to make when it comes to the initial states of reality is going to be that there is a good sense in which natures do constrain what is possible here. So I can quote him here. He says, the initial state of reality has to be the kind of thing that can exist even though there's nothing else in existence. All right. So there's that. Now, then he's going to go on and say, this initial state of reality, there's only a few things that can fill this place. Maybe there's only one thing, right? And it has to be necessarily so. It depends on what he's arguing, if he wants to argue that it's contingent or if he wants to argue that it's necessary, right? Then we have the argument about the tiger popping into existence. And what he's going to say there is that the initial state of reality is going to set up the causal order. You know, we're going to now start having a causal history after this first event. And what he's going to say is that that also constrains what it is possible to do or to have occur or to be actualized if we're speaking in possible world semantics. He's going to say that non-initial things can not come into existence without any cause. That is just not possible for them. And he has a very, it's somewhat confusing. What he's going to say is that there are certain boundary conditions and like limits to any like space in reality. So if a tiger were to pop into my room, right, the initial boundaries and limits would have to be such that it allows for the tiger to be here, right? And part of his reasoning for this is because if a tiger popped into existence where my desk is, right, the desk would first have to be removed so the tiger could appear there. And since it hasn't been instantiated in reality yet, since it's not here, it can't just remove the desk and then come into existence, right? The desk has to already be gone. So then he's going to say this is why causality limits uncaused things from appearing, right? We have certain conditions now as a result of this causal order that make it such that for there to be a displacement, right? Well, there couldn't be any displacement of by an uncaused thing. I can't displace the table in my room because it hasn't appeared yet. So, yeah, I think that's broadly going to be the issue described. I mean, have I sort of answered what you were saying, or did I miss it?
You did indirectly. I'm very happy you read those Oppy quotes because I want to zoom in on one thing you said in particular that I think does vindicate my analysis. And
Yeah.
that's when Oppy said the kind of thing that has to stand in for whatever the initial state is has to be the kind of thing that could exist even if nothing else existed at all. And it turns out that modal possibilities are a very, very good candidate for that kind of a thing. Whatever else is the case, X is still modally possible. And so if we do think of Oppy's initial state as suspensions, right? Nothing's happened yet. So these are suspended possible futures of causal orders, which is why Oppy says there could be a multiverse in the initial state. There could be one universe in the initial state.
Yeah.
They could be determined. They could be undetermined and come about randomly through the process. These all sound to me like modal objects, like suspended possible future causal histories is the best way I can think about them. And if that's the case, that the initial state can't be a rabbit because a rabbit isn't a modal object. It's not a possible causal history that could come to pass if there were time. A rabbit is something that exists as an object in time. It's got a circulatory system. It's got skin. It's got a shape. It's got sorts of physical properties in time. It's an instantiated thing. So it can't be the case if nothing else is the case. So it can't be the rabbit. And as far as why doesn't Oppy's initial state let tigers pop into your room, this is where the category error pops in. Just because modal states via S5 are the kinds of things that happen uncaused doesn't mean that physical Logically contingent things are the kinds of things that can pop into a location uncaused, right? One doesn't entail the other. They're completely different categories of discussion. And that's what we're going to see in Loke's argument. So I've written out my best charitable interpretation of Loke's argument here, and I'll go over that real quick, and then I can just say exactly where the issue is going to be and why, based kind of off this discussion. So what Loke's argument is premise one: if this universe begins to exist uncaused, then there's no in-principle reason that other universes in our space-time block would also begin to exist uncaused until after they begin to exist. If there is no constraint on all the various universes that can begin to exist uncaused, via one, in parallel with our universe, we would expect to see a situation, inevitably, in which universes crash into each other, such as cold spots, with such frequency the stability of the system collapses. And the intuition there is, since it's unconstrained, we should have observed this instability by now if it were going to happen. There's no reason why we wouldn't expect to see it. Premise three: we do not see the unstable system we would expect from two. Therefore, there must be some principled constraint on causal beginnings, and there must be a cause for the beginning of the universe, which would constrain the cause. And the issue there, and all that argument that Oppy is going to take is premise one. It's not our universe that begins to exist uncaused. It's not the physical block of space-time. It's not the physical stuff that can collide into physical stuff to make cold spots that begins uncaused. It's the initial state where time hasn't happened yet, so no physical blocks have necessarily formed yet. Oppy is talking about something in the process of beginning to expand, right? It hasn't done so yet. We're still at t equals 0. There's nothing physical going on there, which could be the kind of thing that would crash into their physical thing to make a cold spot. So premise one is a blatant category error on Loke. And so when Oppy says, no, I'm talking about a kind of necessary thing with properties like this, and Loke just keeps reasserting premise one, it's not going to do any good. His argument doesn't apply to what Oppy's initial state's talking about.
Yeah, exactly. I completely agree. And this argument gets reiterated quite a bit in this debate.
Loke does that.
Yeah. That's what I mean. Sorry. So now let's head over to Oppy, and he talks about what it means for the initial state to be necessary and then uncaused things to exist. So let's let him do his explanation.
On that
Okay,
one,
sure.
before we
Yes,
move on to
yeah.
another argument.
I think that's
Okay,
a good idea. So what I said was that the view is that the initial state is necessary, right? Nothing else. There's nothing else that's necessary. What there is natural reality with a necessary initial state and then subsequent causal evolution.
Cool. That makes sense. We pretty much talked about that. And the line continues here.
There's an initial state, and then there's causal evolution, and it's impossible for anything to belong to natural reality except by way of being part of the necessary initial state or part of the causal evolution. Nothing can pop into existence uncaused, and I've written lots of stuff defending the view that things just can't pop into existence uncaused. So it's a necessary consequence of the view that the only thing that exists without a cause is the initial state, the initial event, and the initial. I'm going to go back to talking about the universe because it's just much simpler than thinking about the multiverse case or other complex examples. Right? I mean, they just don't add anything to the argument to think about them. They just add complexity. Right. So there was nothing in what you said that gave me a reason to prefer the view that there's a necessarily existing God that makes the universe, to the view that the initial state of the universe, both the initial event and the initial object, the universe and the universe's expansion, say, are necessary, metaphysically necessary. The claims that you made about consistency and so on are just false from my point of view.
Perfect. All right. Do you have any thoughts on this part?
No, just backing Oppy up at the end. There's nothing Loke said that would dissuade Oppy from his view. He's just not talking about the kind of thing that Oppy's talking about. When Loke's talking about a whole universe popping into being, you're talking about a thing that's part of the causal evolutionary process in time. And Oppy's view doesn't entail that things like that pop into existence uncaused. Another thing too that I meant to say earlier but I forgot, something that a subtlety that I don't think Loke has caught in this discussion. There's a difference between something having a beginning and something being a beginning, right? Oppy's initial state doesn't have a beginning, because what sense would that make?
Yeah.
Oppy's initial state is the beginning of the natural universe. So it's not the kind of thing that the Kalam cosmological causal principle should even be talking about, right? Anything that has a beginning basically has a cause, right? The cause of me is my mother because I have a beginning, my birth. But Oppy's initial state's necessary, and necessary things aren't the kind of things that have beginnings in the way the Kalam principle is talking about. So even if we put the reasons for it, which I think might be grounded in S5 off the side, just that alone should clue Loke in that he's talking about a different type of thing than Oppy. I don't know why he doesn't get it.
Yeah, I can't remember if this was a point made in the comments or if this was a point covered in the video. But I think I thought that Loke was trying to dissect this beginning, well, this idea that, oh, like Oppy's initial state is a beginning and it has a beginning as well. And it sounded like he was trying to break up like t equals 0 into like 3 like parts. Like it has a begin, t equals 0 has a beginning, it has a middle, and then it has an end. And I thought Oppy's response was that kind of just like confusion because, you know, if time is starting, then it doesn't make sense to break up the start of time into 3 moments like that. You know, it's a point.
Yes.
Not a line. It might have been one of your comments. I can't remember for certain.
It was in the video. Oppy's going to bring it up later.
Okay. Perfect. Then let's see. Now we have an argument concerning fine-tuning, which is not really a problem for Oppy given his theory of modality. But Loke's gonna bring it up anyway. I'll make sure I got the time right. Yeah.
The idea that God exists, right? And one more point is that the difference between the theory that God exists and your theory is this, right? Because your theory, if on your theory, the initial state became uncaused, there will be no cause that has the capacity to determine that our universe will be fine-tuned and highly ordered. I mean, that is the key point of your discussion with William Lane Craig, right? When you all debate about the applicability of mathematics to physical world, right? On your view, it is brute contingency, and it's not only brute contingency. It's worse than that. It's uncaused. There's no cause that has the capacity to explain why is it that our universe is so fine-tuned and highly ordered. Whereas on my view, yes, it involves a brute contingency in the sense that God freely created the universe. There is brute contingency on both views, right? But my view has an additional advantage which your view does not have, which is that on my view, the brute contingency is really willed by God for a reason, right? It's really willed by God, who has the capacity to bring about a universe which is highly ordered and fine-tuned. Why? Because on my view, God is highly intelligent, right? So a highly intelligent God will have the capacity to bring about a universe that is highly ordered and which is fine-tuned, right? And so my view has an advantage over your view, right? So these are the 3 points that I want to say in response to what you have said.
All right. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, I have a book's worth of thoughts on that. The first thing that I think is the elephant in the room is that the idea that the universe is fine-tuned is kind of like a normative interpretation of the physical data, right? It doesn't just jump out at you. Scientists have kind of put this thing together. It's like an extra organizational assumption they're putting on the universe in kind of a quasi-Kantian sense of how we
Yep.
normatively interpret data. So to say that Loke's model is simpler because it can account for an extra assumption that it added to the model
Mm-hmm.
is interesting, to say the least. The next question is, it's supposedly the free choices of God that determine the tuning of the universe. And there's plenty of reasons that now you're appealing to God's free choices. Now you have an extra object. It's not just the universe causality and God as some originator. It's the universe causality, God's choices. So you've added an extra object to attempt to explain an extra layer you've added on to the model. So that's two things that you've added. Next thing you have to account for is there's all sorts of objections that you can make to God's having free will if he's both timeless and omniscient, right? Intuitively, think of it like this. If God is in a sans time state, sans creation, there's no present for God. There's no past, there's no future. And so there's no hypothetical, any of those, right? So if somebody wants to say God freely chose to do something, what they have to say is, well, there's a hypothetical present in which God could have done something else. Well, there's no present in which God does X. There's no hypothetical alternative present in which God freely does Y instead. It all collapses to the same sans time stuff, whatever that stuff looks like. So this idea that God acts contingently, let alone contingently and of libertarian free will, I don't know if that's structurally supportable via the sans time view of the model. But even if it were, right, let's put that off to the side. Even if it were supportable, you now have other objections that you have to deal with. There's the Millian objection, John Stuart Mill's objection to God's omniscience. So what they want to say is the tuning of the universe is the end, and the reasons for it might be some means. Or actually, sorry, the reasons would be the end, right? There's the purpose, and the fine-tuning is the means by which God achieves that purpose. But God's omnipotent, so John Stuart Mill says. And so there's all sorts of ways God could achieve his ends without any particularized means. And so what the theist is going to have to say is all reasons are going to be intrinsic reasons. So God does X because God wants to do X. There's no external reason to appeal to. They all have to be circular. Well, that's bad enough. But I don't know if you've heard Jack and Josh. They have this argument about a Bilgramian view of intentionality, where an omnipotent being can't fail to be out of accord with its desires. So you wouldn't say like a lightning bolt tried to hit a barn, failed and hit a tree instead. Alternatively, so Josh actually got into a debate with Inspiring Philosophy on some Q&A in a Discord server. I watched a video of that. It was pretty fun. And an interesting example came up with Alexander the Great, right? And Josh kind of fumbled a bit. I think he hadn't quite nailed down his argument, but I kind of nailed it down after the thing. So I think here's the example. Suppose that it's logically impossible for Alexander the Great to lose a battle. And that's Inspiring Philosophy's example. Now, let's suppose there's some princess that Alexander the Great wants to marry to forge an alliance, right? She's hot or something. Now, if Alexander the Great fights that country in open combat and he beats them, suppose there's some chance that the army falls, instability happens in the capital, the royal family is killed and executed by revolutionaries or something, right? Well, at that point, even though it's impossible for Alexander the Great to lose the battle, he would choose not to fight it because fighting the battle would be out of accord with his desire to marry the princess. So even if Alexander the Great's omnipotent with respect to winning battles, he's not omnipotent to the consequences of his actions, which could be out of accord with what he wants to do on the basis of those actions. So Alexander the Great would fail to fight the battle. But suppose that Alexander the Great was globally omnipotent in the sense that he could win the battle, snap his fingers, put a shield around the royal family that would just make them impervious to harm until his army arrived at the capital to provide security for the royal family, at which point he could marry his princess. Well, at that point, whether Alexander the Great does or doesn't fight the battle, neither option would be out of accord with his other desires relating to the matter. But this also gives an important thing. There's an important consideration here now that anything that God does could be a thing he just wanted to do in the Millian sense. but it could also be a ride-along thing that he does to shore up the first thing he's done, so the first thing isn't out of accord with his other desires. So there's the battle Alexander the Great can fight, and then there's the shield he'd put around the family after the battle, right? So did he fight the battle to be either to marry the princess or to fail to be out of accord with marrying the princess? No, turns out that's the shield's job. So given any action God's done, including the tuning of the universe, was that action based on a particular reason, like God having a relationship, or was it a ride-along reason to account for something else God had done, right? That analysis gets very, very complicated. And so if you look at, say, the Milbil-Gramy pincher, and the way they talk about that, and you have to have some schema, not only of God's reasons, but an accounting of God's reasons that would navigate this absolute minefield of what it means to act freely, let alone contingently, which is the timeless problem I put off to the side. You have to have some schema of reasons that accounts for all three of those dynamics. So you've got God, the extra thing. You've got the fine-tuning, the extra thing. You've got God's reasons, the extra thing. And you have the schema of God's reasons, the extra thing. All trying to account for fine-tuning, which is something that was imposed extra on our observation in the first place. With respect to the anthropic principle, the weak anthropic principle, I'm not convinced that Oppy needs to discuss fine-tuning as part of his model. It's just a fact of the matter that, well, two things. Beings that aren't supported in their universes won't observe those universes. And then also, if a universe, the only universes that living beings will observe are the universes that support their kind of life, basically is the weak anthropic principle. Now, what theists will try out in response to that is the sharpshooter analogy, right? But the problem with the sharpshooter analogy is that the weak anthropic principle actually goes two ways. And while the sharpshooter analogy accounts for one direction, whereby you survive the firing squad. So anthropically, you can only observe you survived the firing squad because you've done so. Okay, that's one direction of the anthropic principle. But what I usually throw back on the theist with respect to this regard is, well, let's flip it. Let's suppose you had a child, right, who doesn't know what guns are. They're just big, long sticks that make big, loud noises. They've never seen a firing squad before. They don't know they've seen people fail to survive them, right? So you line the child against the wall, you blindfold them, you point the guns their direction, or maybe they're looking at the guns. They just don't know what they are, right? Loud noises go off, guns go off, and off they go, right? The loud noises will be traumatic. But is that child in any capacity to think that there's some sort of miracle in their survival? No, they probably didn't even know there were any danger. It's probably a prank the grown-ups were playing on them to scare them. So the thing the sharpshooter analogy the theists provide, what it misses is the fact that when you look at all the people killed by firing squads, you are saying that you're observing failures to live in these universes. But what the anthropic principle also says is that life, beings that need life-permitting universes will never observe the universes which would fail to let them live. And so you can't use a sharpshooter analogy because we can see other people die by firing squad. So to use a sharpshooter analogy correctly with the weak anthropic principle, you'd have to use a child or something that was completely ignorant to the whole mechanics of it. And would the child think it's miraculous they lived? No, they had no idea what was going on, right? So just based on a proper interpretation of the weak anthropic principle, it's not even clear to me that it's justified to add this extra fine-tuning assumption to the model. But if you wanted to explain it, given what Loke wants to do, that's a gargantuan task that could fill tomes. It's certainly not simple than whatever Oppy's alternative is. But then also, even if you wanted to add it in, I'm pretty sure, given what you started off by saying, that Oppy's model could handle it if we did want to shoehorn it in. So maybe you've got something to say about that.
Well, before I do that, I do want to toss a question your way, which is someone raised this to me before, and I didn't really know how to think about it. But the question he asked was, well, it was more of a claim. He doesn't think that probabilities make sense when we have no information about the thing in question. And so the thing in question would be, the constants of the universe, the cosmological constants. Why are they at one number as opposed to a different number. And, those proponents of the fine-tuning argument are going to say, like, look, it's this really small number. You change like one tiny little thing, and then it's a different number, and we don't have the universe anymore. And there's an infinite amount of numbers, right? So super low probability. The claim that the person I was talking with was making was saying that probability doesn't work that way. We can't make claims like that. How do you feel about that as a math guy?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And
because you were kind of like maybe talking about that a little bit with your reverse anthropic principle argument. So that's what made me think of it.
Yeah. So let me relate what I said about the anthropic principle to what you asked, and then I can make a broader discussion about that. So the weak anthropic principle would just say that living beings only observe universes which fail, which allow them to live and observe those universes. And on the flip side, they fail to observe those universes in which they couldn't live and make observations, right? Now, in order to let's think of it this way. If you're a frequentist, and this is something that'll come up in Capturing Christianity's videos, there's this idea of like frequentism, Bayesianism, and there's like epistemic Bayesian probabilities. There's all sorts of ways about that. As far as the math is concerned, the math could say anything about all three of the models, because math is basically putting to words the pattern we're trying to talk about. So you give me a pattern, we'll put the math to it. So there'll probably be some Kolmogorov axiom somewhere. There'll probably be some probabilistic things you'll have to say to make it make sense. But as far as the objects being measured, what actually goes in the sets, the math doesn't really care so much about what objects you put in the sets, whether the objects are intuitions, whether they are exact data observations, things like that. That's something. But if you want to be a frequentist, you have to be able to calculate empirically. You want to run a simulation, do an experiment, do something, and find data points where universes happen and fail to happen. And what the weak anthropic principle is saying is, no matter what experiments you run and are able to observe, you'll only find over and over and over again life-permitting universe, because you're a being that has to have one to observe one. So if there are failures, you just don't know what they are or how many they are. Now, a response to that would be, well, what if we're not a frequentist, right? What if we don't want to have to observe first and ask questions later? And want to have some Bayesian notion of priors, where we have some prior estimate of what's going on, and we roll with that. Now, that's fair, but the thing of it is, any prior you come up with is going to be like a model. So I can have a model in which my prior is this, and somebody else can have a model in which their prior is that. And this actually goes back to Oppy's discussion about arguments, right? So people are going to have some intuition, epistemic or otherwise, about what the priors might look like.
Yeah.
And so there's no mathematical way to adjudicate that, not really. And so what you're going to have to do is bring your intuitions into the priors and justify why you think the priors might be some way or another way. And there's just a plethora of problems. So one of the major problems is that if you read Robin Collins' article in the Blackwell Companion, so he says that scientists think they have this this interval called an experimental interval, where the numbers could be for each constant based on simulations and other things they've come up with. Right? They're convinced that this is a fairly reasonable bounds to put on the constants, and so our constants are somewhere around here. There's some tiny radius around our constants, which things aren't life permitting, and there's some really big experimental interval where the constants could theoretically end up based on initial states of the universe or whatever scientists say. But that's not enough to form a Bayesian prior on the matter, right? Because the critical assumption that Robbins makes is that is that the interval has a uniform distribution. And he says that because he appeals to the indifference principle, where in the absence of evidence, there's no reason to assume any particular distribution about a point or about a collection of things, right? If you don't know anything, we might as well just not assume any distribution whatsoever. And so the uniform's the default choice. Well, intuitively, not in terms of empirical probabilities or any question begging in terms of physicalism or naturalism. There's all sorts of reasons why the initial distributions might not be uniform. So here's a good example. A theist could object. So look at Leibniz's argument for the existence of God in the monadology. If we think there's some random chance, random process that could make the constants otherwise, if they're logically contingent, well, if we take Gottfried Leibniz's intuition there, that means there's some mechanism under the constants, and the constants move and be otherwise because the mechanism underneath moves them. Well, could the mechanism be otherwise? Well, yeah, okay, there's some mechanism under that. And this is how Leibniz dug to the monad, right? He went underneath, atoms, molecules, quarks, all the way down. And the very, very base thing that makes everything else move, that's kind of like coextensive in some way with the mind of God, that's the monad. But let's not go there. Let's just go one level below. There's some mechanism underneath the constant in a Leibnizian intuition that makes the constant move in the first place. And let's say the mechanism moves randomly, and that's why the constant moves randomly. Well, let's say there's 100 things like quanta that in aggregate through their random motions then fix the constant. And the constant is actually some asymptotic thing. So they move over time, and eventually there's going to be a steady state on all their actions. They cancel each other out to some sort of steady state. It's an asymptotic principle in statistics. The central limit theorem is just an obvious one, right? So if you take a Leibnizian interpretation, which isn't question begging for naturalism or anything else, Leibniz was a theist, you could end up getting that each constant is normally distributed, because if it's contingent on things underneath moving it. And even if the things underneath act uniformly, once you jumble them all together, right, no matter what the underlying population looks like, if you carefully construct your central limit theorem, you get the normal bell-shaped distribution. So it turns out, without question begging for any naturalism or anything like that, you could have the distribution of your constants purely normally distributed. And a normal distribution has two parameters. Now here's where this gets really, really interesting, because we want to figure out, he wants to say that the universe isn't likely, right? But how hypothesis tests go is you'd have to, you have a null hypothesis about what the parameters look like, and you want to figure out if there's an alternative hypothesis about what the parameters look like, and you reject the null, fail to reject the null, and so forth. But the problem is you only have one sample point. So this actually does go back to the one sample point problem. If you've got two parameters and you have to have some conceptual null hypothesis test to adjudicate on what those parameters might look like, it seems to me that you're just going to have a band of pairs of parameters on each of these normal distributions that would fail to reject the null about our assumptions about the parameters that's consistent with the existence of our universe. And so once you kind of make that move, you can't actually conclude the universe is unlikely, because you know what the parameters are. It'd be begging the question. You can't say I'm going to pick the parameters that would make our universe unlikely. What you have to do is pick a pair of parameters for each normal distribution to be consistent with the data. And also, because you have all these constants, what you'd want to do is you'd want to do what's called a correction factor. It's like a Bonferroni correction factor or something like that. And you'd pick the factors, not that you pick the pairs of parameters such that not only would they solve their own hypothesis test, but that the conjunction of them would solve the conjunction of hypothesis tests consistent with all of our universal constants. So it's not clear to me that they can apply the indifference principle and jump straight to uniform, because depending on your intuition going into the argument, you may not be indifferent. You might be a Leibnizian, for example. Hopefully that wasn't too rambling. It made some sense.
No, it definitely did. I mean, that was one of the criticisms I had when I read that paper, although it certainly wasn't that articulate. It was just kind of like, I feel like this indifference principle that Collins is pushing doesn't really work. I'm not following it. So yeah, that's perfect. Awesome. Do you have any more thoughts on this section, or should we move on to Oppy?
Yeah, like I say, I have a lot of thoughts on this section.
Oh,
but
you're right.
I don't want to dwell here. I don't ask me sometime about my genie parody against the fine-tuning argument. I think you'll get a kick out of that, but I don't want to derail the conversation from this. I just find so here's the thing: bias is here on the table, right? When you look at the arguments for God, there's some I find interesting, compelling, and worth studying. The weakest two arguments, in my opinion, are the fine-tuning argument is the weakest, and the Kalam is the second weakest. And Loke has made the mistake of taking his already tenuous argument, in my opinion, and adding on the only argument weaker than itself in hopes that it would actually bolster the argument. And so yes, I'd have tomes to say about all the ways this goes wrong for Loke, but I don't want to hold up the conversation.
All right, I will definitely pursue this genie question with you later. This sounds pretty interesting. But all right, let's get Mr. Oppy's response here.
Last one, so I'll talk about it,
Okay.
and then you can remind me about the others. So you'll know if you were listening to my debate with William Lane Craig that I didn't claim that the fine-tuning is brutally contingent. I claimed that it's necessary, and so it has exactly the same explanation. In saying that the initial state exists of necessity, assuming that the values of the constants are determined at that point, they couldn't have been otherwise, right? That just falls out of what I've already committed myself to. So it's not an extra assumption that I need to make. So the idea that there's a brute contingency there, I think, is just mistaken. Of course, it could be that the fixing of the values of the constants happens at some non-initial point as a result of some process. In that case, on any view, it will turn out to be a brute contingency, and that's fine. But on the assumption that it's fixed in the initial state, whether it's fixed by God's preferences or it's fixed in the way that I imagine, it'll be necessary.
All right, so that's Oppy's quick response. Now, yeah, so essentially what he's going to be saying in response to the fine-tuning, and he says it in the best argument for God, I think. He lists out the two options that were given. So this has to do with his branching theory of modality, right? Like was said, we have an easy way to think about it is there's just this like one starting point and everything builds off of that. All the possibilities have this one starting point, and therefore the cosmic parameters are going to be a brute fact. Then I think he does. I can't remember the exact argument that he uses in the book. But I think he tries to say that, like, you can't give me the reason for why God chose these parameters. So, like it's a brute fact, like was said. And so, therefore, in naturalism, we have a draw because we could also just posit that it's a brute fact and not like a necessary part of the necessary initial state. So Loke's whole idea of like, hey, but God has a reason for it doesn't really follow because ostensibly there are worlds in which he chooses not to create anything at all. If we're taking, like a broader understanding of modality with respect to God. So, yeah, and then there's worlds in which he creates other stuff, in which he doesn't create humans. Assuming that we don't have like a Leibnizian conception of God and necessity. So yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, do you have any comments or?
Yeah, this is so. One of the things I wrote in my notes about Loke's thing, I want to mention this briefly before I talk about Oppy, is one of the big risks is when you have a necessary being through some reason determining the outcome of a particular contingent state of affairs, one of the things you're very much at risk for is necessitarianism on that view. Whenever you have a necessary thing determining a particular outcome, that's a thread you've got to tread very carefully.
Yep.
Now, that applies just as much for Loke as it does for Oppy. So if Oppy wants to say that some of the initial conditions of the universe are just necessarily so as part of the initial state, there risks being a problem, because we want to say that there's a causal history where possible things could have happened by chance or whatever. But if Oppy's not careful, he could say that enough things are a necessary part of the initial state that there are no alternative branches the causal history could have taken, because he's kind of put so much in there that everything ended up being determined. There's no chance to apply. But Oppy did put two options up there, right? So the one, he said the parameters could have been, and built into the necessary initial state. But the other thing he did say is the parameters could have been tuned by chance, and so they'd be brute contingent facts. I think Oppy will want to lean into the second one, and I think that he will want to use the weak anthropic principle to do the rest of the work. I think if he does that, that would be the better option than the first thing he said, which in my view puts him at risk of necessitarianism.
Yeah. Yeah, that would also be my guess at the way he goes. Although in anything that I've read, he doesn't take like a hardline stance on it. Oppy's a man that prefers options.
Yes.
So cool. You want to move into this next clip? This one's kind of funny. So
sure, let's do it.
All right.
Okay, so let me respond to that, right? So, so you're saying that the fine tuning is necessary, right? You're saying that it is determined, right? But I want to ask, right, determined by what? Because it has no cause, right? Because it has a beginning and no cause, right? So as I illustrated using my house building analogy, right? If my house begins to exist uncaused, then there's no cause. That makes it the case that it's a house rather than a pile of rubble, right? So on your view, there is no cause, right? That makes it necessary, right? It just began necessarily, right? But,
okay, so let me do the same thing. On your view, God exists of necessity. But what's the cause, right? You don't need causes for necessity.
Yeah, in the case of God, there's no need, because as I said, God exists beginninglessly, right? So something that is beginningless is always, has always been like that, right?
All right. I think that's the end of
the
segment. Yeah.
So remember when we were talking earlier about Loke's causal principle and how he could apply it given the little circle inside the bigger circle, right? The little circle is the things that have beginnings, and the big circle is all the cause things. What Loke is trying to say here is that because God's not in the little circle of things with beginnings, he must not be in the big circle. But there's a space where you're in the big circle without being in the little one, right? There's a place where you're in one but not in the other. He can't say what he's just done. And Oppy is going to be beside himself. Like, how could you say that? And so the questions I've gotten from people about this in the comment are, well, can you give me an example of things that don't have beginnings in either sense but are still caused? It's like, yeah, okay. I'm not even going to try to do some like atheistic examples. There are theistic examples. Let's take theistic activism, divine activism. I forget exactly what it's called, but there's a book by Stephen Jay Gould, I think his name is, which is talking about God and abstracta and paradoxes and how to resolve them and things like this. There's like 5 views in this book, and I think 2 of them were like variations of divine activism, where abstracta, such as mathematical objects, they don't enter any temporal relations or temporal existence. They transcend over all physical things that are the case, but they're still caused by God. So they're beginningless. They don't depend on time whatsoever. They don't enter into time whatsoever, and yet they're still caused by God. So those would be theistic things. We're not begging the question against theism here. These are theistic models where you have abstracta outside the little circle of things with beginnings, but are still inside the big circle of things that are caused under Thomism. So that's the not in time relevant idea of beginning. But then you have the Thomistic idea of like eternality. Thomas Aquinas said the universe may be eternal. So it may be without beginning because it's always in time, but just never begins. But it's still caused by God. I went over all the ways in which Thomists can talk about intrinsic causes. So there's so many ways without even appealing to atheistic explanations in which Loke is just blatantly begging the question against other theists, let alone atheists.
Yeah. It just, I don't know. I feel like he's kind of just misunderstanding what's going on here a little bit. And then this next exchange is going to be pretty important for showing that Loke isn't able to see like the issue that he currently has with his position. So let's go over there now.
There is no infinite regress because
But
God
it's
is
beginningless, so
is
there's an
timeless.
infinite regress. Right,
no,
but there's an
they
infinite
are-
regress. There's no beginning, right? So pick any state, there's a state before it, because if there isn't a state before it, then it's a beginning. So there's an infinite regress. So we've now gone back to somewhere near the beginning, and you've taken back one of the premises of your argument.
All right. So what's being said here is the Oppy is pushing back on this idea of being changeless and then deciding to like create the universe. And what he's thinking is, all right, sure, God, I can accept that God isn't in some sort of temporal order, right? But that doesn't mean that there isn't like other dimensions in which we can understand this and sort of track out what's going on here. So I don't want to steal too much of your thunder, Lotus, because I think you explained it very eloquently. So maybe I'll just hand it over to you with the what's being said here with this infinite regress idea and changelessness.
Right. So one of the best ways to explain something in plain English is I tell you, this is why I watch the Krill Gang and then just go at each other, because they break it down to layman's level. They really do. Okay, so I was watching a discussion with Jack, Josh, and some other guy who didn't know how he felt about the Kalam. Maybe true, maybe not be true. He's agnostic, but he's trying to play devil's advocate and see what he can get away with and see if it works. You know, if it can stand the muster of these two, titans, basically. And there's some point in the conversation that I had to pause the video and just laugh at for a good 5 minutes. I kid you not, because the absurdity of it was just great. Okay, so I have a paraphrase of the quote. So let me see if I can find it here. Yes. Okay. So the guy talking says, yes, there was no universe sans time. And Josh says, exactly. The universe failed to exist at no point in time. The guy says, exactly. And Josh says, right. The guy says, what's the problem? And Josh says, what you've basically said is the universe has never failed to exist. The guy says, no, I'm just saying if you look at sans time. And Josh says, but sans time means at no time or event. It means never. Right? When we talk about sans time, it's like the meme, right? When somebody gives some account of some crazy thing that happened on Twitter, and everybody's just like, yeah, that totally happened, right? The meme is, I'll take things that never happened for 500, Alex, right? That meme. We know that meme. When somebody hears that meme, do we think there's a pocket sans time dimension in which this event actually happened? Or do we think, no, it just never happened, right? So when we talk about things that never happened or happened sans time at no point in time ever, the obvious intuition of that is it's a nothing burger. What are you talking about, right?
Yep.
But Loke wants to talk about this as if there's some there, that there is a sans time state for God. This is like a robust state where things are going on and we can talk about them in a way that's not absurd. And so what Oppy says is, well, we have to give it some extension. That's exactly what he says. We have to give it some extension, which means you're going to have to fill that with something meaningful that happens. And it's either going to be causal. It can't be temporal because it's about time. So let's suppose for the sake of argument that it's causal. And the question is, well, look, that he basically forces a dilemma on Loke here. He says, well, look, there's some indexed set of something, probably causal, going on in the timeless state, which doesn't even make sense. There's no present events to talk about in the timeless state, but we're going to go full colloquial here because we're doing the best we can. Okay. So in quote unquote, the timeless state, there's a sequence of stuff going on. And that sequence is either infinite or it's finite, right? Well, it can't be infinite because if you look at the paradoxes, right? So Oppy says, well, it's probably infinite, right? Because you don't want to commit to God beginning to do something, because if it's finite, it has a beginning, and so it has a cause, and so you'd be committed to saying some third absurd thing like causality has a cause, because the beginning thing in the index would be causal, right? We're assuming it's causality, and so it would, if it has a beginning in the Kalam sense, then it has to have a cause. So causality has a cause. So I guess next we're going to talk about what's north of the North Pole, quoting the famous Copleston Russell debate. But Loke says, no, it doesn't begin to exist in that sense. And so Oppy's like, okay, well, then it's infinite. And so you have an infinite causal index in this sans time state, in which case you actually don't have the problem with an infinity of causal events, right? Because if you look at the Grim Reaper paradox, you can construct that mathematically without invoking any particular notion of time. Loke tries to say that it's continuous time that's the problem. That's not true. Time is just a context we give it to tell the story. I've constructed this purely mathematically by just using sequence and functions on sequences that map to 0 and 1 with certain rules, and you get the exact contradiction that you would have gotten. So the exact notion of time, it turns out, isn't relevant for the Grim Reaper paradox, only causality, in that what comes out of the function has to be in some way dependent on the prior thing that came out of the function. So one index has to causally affect the next one. So all you really need is a causal index, and that's all Oppy's talking about here. And if there's an infinite causal index, it's the exact type of infinite series of causes that Loke would want to avoid via his paradoxes. So either way, he's kind of in trouble. And so the third option is, well, look, if it's not causality and it's not time, and it's sans time, and we already talk about events that never happened as like empty, vacuous, like they're nonsense. What work, Oppy uses this exact phrasing, what work is the sans time part of this model actually doing here, if we can't talk about it with any sort of substance?
Beautiful, exactly. And we're going to see that part of in the next clip, where Loke is going to try to reject that there is this infinite regress in any sort of duration or like extension in which God has to think, like, do I go from changeless now?
Right.
And then that'll open him up to what Oppy calls a left-ow criticism. Let me see. There we go.
Okay, no, that's wrong actually, because now by a point is something within a dimension, right? But what I'm saying is that God is not in any dimension, right? God is not in any dimension or time, and therefore God is initially changeless. So by saying initially changeless, I'm not committed to the view that God exists within a duration which exists within a dimension. In fact, I'm denying it. I'm saying that there's no dimension where God exists changelessly without any dimension, without any not in any point. But it's beyond any dimension. That's what I mean by God. So by saying that God is changeless, I'm not committed to a duration.
All right. So now he's opening himself up to the sort of like, well, then I don't really know what we're talking about here, kind of criticism.
Yes.
And we're going to see Oppy kind of drill him on that. So, I mean, do you have any comments here?
This is standard. This is Craig stuff. I've heard this in all sorts of arguments. Yeah, we can go.
All right. Oppy's going to take a really long pause here, trying to figure out what he's going to say.
As he should. Like, what do you do with this?
Exactly. What's being, because it's, it sounded like he initially rejected that when he was talking about changelessness the first round, right? Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden now he's like going back on it. So you're just kind of like, it's whiplash almost, I think, is what's going on here, where it's like, I don't really know where we're at anymore. Anyway, here we go.
This sounds to me like, as though the notion of being changeless isn't now doing any work, because what you just said, I think, was that if God's beyond any dimension, the notion of change, as with lots of other notions, is going to have no application. right? It's not, if we go back to the, you wanted to say God was beginningless, right? And the idea, I thought, was that this was something that belonged to a dimension where it made sense to talk about having a beginning rather than not having a beginning. And now it turns out that what you're saying is actually that this language about change, beginning, and so on, just has no application to God. It's so here's an example. In his book on time and eternity, Brian Lefto tried to claim that God's at zero distance from everything, right? And the reason that he gave was because the notion of distance has no application to God. But you can't make, the distance between two things is zero just in case they're the same thing, right? It's because the distance zero assumes that it's something that belongs to the field where you can apply a measure to it, rather than it being something that's to which the notion of measure is inapplicable. Right. So now I'm wondering whether I'm still thinking that you're doing something similar here. When you, in the discussion that was framed about that whatever begins to exist has a cause.
All right. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds basically like what we're saying. I mean, Oppy is so polite and so laid back and so just kind of quiet and tepid about how he's describing it. Like, if this were with one of the Krill gang, he'd just be saying, "Listen, right? What you've basically said is that God was never changeless because there's no duration. Nothing happened. You know, they'd be grilling him, right? And that's the point here is there's not even a single point in time. There's not a present. There's not an anything in the sans time state where God is or isn't changeless. Another example I give of this, right? So suppose you have a video recording where a bunch of people are moving and something like this. There's a statue in the middle of the room, right? And you remark that, oh wow, that statue hasn't moved, hasn't done anything, right? Maybe a bunch of kids are running around a room with an expensive statue, and you're marveling at the fact that no kids have bumped into the statue and knocked over. So with respect to the events in the room, the statue is changeless. We all look at that and go, oh, well, that makes a lot of sense because time's moving, things are happening, and the statue is right where it's at. Got it. We all know what's going on. Now, let's suppose somebody paused the video and showed you a still frame and said, see how the statue in this frame is changeless? but everything in the video is holding completely still. So you'd point to that and say, well, yeah, everything's changeless in the video you showed me. It's paused. That's what paused looks like. You've frozen things at a single point in time. Of course, there's no change to speak of there. It's a single point in time. What are we talking about, right? But it's even worse than that, right? That would be the Leftow style thing where Oppy thinks that Loke is trying to have his cake and eat it, where he's trying to describe like a present for God, in which in that present God's changeless. But what Oppy is going to try to point out is it's not even that Loke is showing an Oppy a paused video and saying, look, in this moment, the statue hasn't moved. It's worse than that. There's no event in a sans time state whatsoever, which means there's no event on record, which means there would be no video recording. It'd be like trying to point to your hand where recording should be and say, look, in this sans time event, there's a statue that hasn't moved. That's the level of oddity we're getting to here with this model. And Oppy saying, what's the work being done? Right? You can't even say that there's like a zero time where God doesn't move. There's no time whatsoever in the sans time state. So what are we talking about?
Yeah, exactly. In the next section, what's going to happen is that Loke is going to bring time into the discussion again. And it's going to show that he doesn't know the sort of trap that he's fallen into. Like he either has to take this left out position, or he has to take the infinite regress. Right? Those are his only two options here. Right?
Yeah, basically.
And he's just not aware of it, and he keeps going back to time. So
Yep.
Oppy's going to ask him, like, what does initial mean then? Because that's what you said. And he's going to say, it means like original state. And then he's going to talk about time again, and Oppy's going to, ask if it's a causal term or not either. And then what Oppy's going to say is like, hey, initial is referring to an order. So like we don't need like any sort of metric by which to measure this before and after.
Yeah, you're right. What he is going to note there is there has to be an indexed.
Yeah.
Which right went to there's like an indexed series of causes in quote unquote, because there actually are no events in the sans time state, but as best as we can describe it in the sans time state in whatever manner that would make sense, there is a sequence of at least causal events.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think what Oppy says later is if he takes the left owl horn and this dilemma that he's facing, then we have trouble differentiating between God existing right now and then the universe coming from God at that moment. We lose this before and after distinction because we've kind of just thrown out all of this with this, God isn't in any dimension, and there's no, it's not applicable to him. Changelessness doesn't mean anything when it comes to God, really. So,
right,
that is definitely a big issue now. Let me pull up my next segment. All right. We're going to be talking about theories of time here now. Yeah.
Because you've got two choices here. You can either go discrete and have discrete moments, or you can have density and you'll have points, right, in the sense that you're now saying is objectionable. The problem with discrete time is that nobody's yet been able to make a physics that works with discrete time. So our physical theories, all successful physical theories, are couched in terms of continuous time. If you're going to go with the kind of Zeno-style objections to continuous time, you'll end up in a problem. But for the purposes of this argument, it doesn't matter. We can go discrete, right? We can suppose that there's one discrete point for God prior to in the causal order, because nothing's happening. There's no change, right? There's nothing that can give it a duration, right? There's nothing that can give it extension. There's nothing that so far that you've said that makes it anything else than an extra causal point at the beginning, right?
Now, so as I said earlier on, I don't like to use the word point.
You did say changeless, and if we're thinking about that as a state, as a continuing state where there's no change happening, right? There's that might mean extended, or it might mean point. Either way, it seems to me you're going to get problems. But
all right. So one thing I wanted to ask you was about the discrete versus density distinction with respect to theories of time.
Right. This boils down to Zeno-like paradoxes, as Oppy was talking about. So what it means for something to be continuous, basically, is that for any point, you can kind of keep digging and find another point in between, and keep digging and digging and digging. So the Zeno's paradox would say, okay, for an arrow to fly to hit a target, it has to travel half its distance. And it has to travel half of that half, and half of that half, and keep having things, quote unquote, forever. And philosophically speaking, it's the continuity of time which would allow somebody to keep having the duration forever until and so the idea is the limit as n approaches infinity of 1 over 2 to the n, right? Having things n times infinitely is 0. The intuition there is once you've cut the sets small enough over an infinite number of pieces using this algorithm, you're talking about points, and points don't have motion or duration or anything like that. So the arrow just shouldn't move, right? Because it has to travel over each individual point, but no individual point has motions because it's just a single point. It's a frozen point in time. So how does the arrow go anywhere? So the intuition there is that it's the infinite divisibility of time, its continuity, that allows this problem to happen. And so the alternate view that might want to solve that is to discretize time, to make it discrete and say there's some fundamental unit of time so small, right? You get seconds, milliseconds, you can keep cutting those up, but eventually you're going to get to a point that's so small that you can't cut it up anymore. It just doesn't make any sense. It's gobbledygook if you even try, so just don't do it. Those are the discrete fundamental units of time. There's a unit in physics that Planck units of time that are often thrown around in these conversations. And I'm not a physicist, so I can't tell you definitively, but some people might think that those that I've heard, Christians anyway, defending Zeno's paradox type objections, would say that maybe those Planck units might be the fundamental units of time. Now, the other way you could respond to it, if you do think time is continuous, is to say that, well, hold on. What you're doing is conflating discussions of points in time with discussions of events in time. So the arrow traveling in time is different from the events in which the points in time which it travels. So what they'd want to say is, we're just going to say that time could be continuous, but if you're talking about any event, you're talking about something measurable. And there's an entire branch of mathematics called real analysis, and there's a sub branch of that called measure theory that looks into all sorts of paradoxical questions about how you can measure collections and sub-collections of points on sets. And so what they would say is, anytime you're talking about an event in time, you are talking about measurable intervals, which means there's some positive measure. There's always some there. And continuous points always have measure 0. So you can't break an event down. So basically what they'd say is something like you're committing a fallacy of division, where you're trying to take the event, which only makes sense to talk about over a measurable interval, and you're trying to cut it into measure 0 intervals. But when you do that, you've lost all context of the event. So of course an absurdity is going to follow, right? So you can't do that. But it's not because time can't be chopped up anymore. It's because an assumption about the event under discussion is that you're talking about a measurable duration of time in which the event is embedded in a context. It's contextualized there. And so if you try to talk about the time in a way that removes the event's context, of course you'll get the absurdity. That has nothing to do with time. It has to do with the context you've removed from the event. Remove enough context from any event, and absurd things will happen. So that's what that might be a response open to people who believe in the continuous model of time. But that's the fundamental question: is there a unit of time so small that there's just nothing smaller, or could time be smaller, but it doesn't make sense to talk about smaller units given events under discussion? But as Oppy points out, no matter which model you take or which reasons you take for that model, it actually doesn't have bearing on his discussion, because sans time God means no time, discrete or continuous. So if at no time God was changeless, why can't we just say God was never changeless and be done with it? Loke still hasn't got the fundamental issue here, which is, where's the there, right? Where's the sense in which you can't use the word never to accurately describe sans time God? And he's not giving us an instance why it doesn't make sense to say God was never X as a sans time state. And until he does so, we're just left scratching our heads.
Perfect. That makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I mean, I don't see Loke getting out of this issue.
No.
And I think Graham understands, Oppy understands that. And so he's going to want to move into his whole theory comparison shtick.
Yes.
As a result. So let's go there now.
You can't say that God has a beginning in that sense.
Okay, so let's go back and compare the two views now. So we both agree that there's, making the simplifications about what natural reality looks like. There's a natural universe, right? It's got an initial boundary. And I say that initial boundary is necessary. So there's a necessary existence, necessary event, and there's a causal principle, sorry, an explanatory principle that says that everything has an explanation, and a causal principle that says that all non-initial things have causes. So you accept that there's the universe. You think that the initial state is contingent. You think that there's a God who exists in some very hard to describe way beforehand, but is the cause of the existence of the universe. If we think about the two views and we think about their merits, we think about their simplicity, and we think about what they can explain, then it seems to me that as far as the universe goes, everything gets an explanation either way. As far as necessity goes, we each agree there's something that's necessary. In terms of entities, my view is slightly better because it does without God. So insofar as we're interested just in thinking about the explanation of the universe, it looks as though my view's winning. It looks like it's a better view when we just think about the theories and their virtues. Right? I don't think that there's anything in any of the arguments that you've given that overturns that view. That seems to me where we are at this point, right? And the question about the question about which arguments we think is sound is fully settled by what we say about in our theories. So I say that that there's an explanation for everything. Right? You think that there's an explanation for everything too. Right? I think that every non-initial thing has a cause. You think that every non-initial thing has a cause. It's just that your non-initial thing is God, whereas my initial thing is the first stage of the universe, and your initial thing is God. We think all the non-initial things have causes. It's not that we're disagreeing about very much here, but the explanatory principles are much the same. What we think there is much the same. It's just that you've got this, as I see it, you've got this idle wheel in your explanatory framework. It's not doing anything. It's not buying you any advantages whatsoever.
All right. So I talked about this earlier in the way that Oppy likes to do arguments, and part of the reason that he levels this sort of like meta dialectical move is because I think it comes from his history studying philosophy. He used to be into philosophy of science and used to be into mathematics. And so I think that's what he studied actually while he was doing his PhD. And then a little bit afterwards. And he only came into philosophy of religion once he had to take a class, once he had to teach a class on it. So the reason that he's conceiving of these things this way is because this is become sort of the new paradigm in philosophy of science is a theory comparison. And, you know, we could trace this back to Kuhn maybe and talk about paradigms and you know, his idea of incommensurability, and but even Kuhn has like some like primitive idea of what goes into theory choice. So that's part of the way that he argues, and in his book, The Best Argument for God or Against God, he's going to say that you know, theists can still this is a kind of argument, this theory choice issue with simplicity and whatnot, and deists can rationally reject it and come to different conclusions. So this isn't definitive, but part of what you got to do is be able to show that you don't have, more commitments than he does on his view of naturalism. So, yeah.
Sounds about right. And I haven't studied philosophy of science personally. I've done a little looking into philosophy of mathematics, some philosophy of religion, but not really philosophy of science. But one thing I have studied a bit in doing graduate work in statistics is the idea of confounding. The idea that you want to say that some variable causes something else in your model. But the more variables you add, the more likely it's going to be that they tangle up. And some combination of those variables might affect the outcome, but you don't know which is the one doing the push and the pull, which is the one doing the work. And so to bring this back to the conversation with Oppy and Loke here, at the initial state, Oppy's comfortable saying, okay, something's happening at the initial state, right? On Loke's model, God's doing something, right? At t equals 0, God's bringing something about. Just like for Oppy's initial state, something is in the process of being brought about. It hasn't happened yet, but it's like in the process of about to happen. Same thing. Like you said, they both agree on that. But Loke has added extra variables. There's a sans time state for God. So when you want to talk about something happening in the universe, right, which variable caused it? Is it what happened for God sans time, or is it what happened for God at the moment of creation? Well, post hoc to deal with challenges, you can make a post hoc decision on this, but it's not clear that there's going to be one that entails from the model. Okay, now you've got more problems. You have to have something in the sans time thing to talk about God without saying God never did X. There's going to be some there, some indexing, some causality, something. Okay, so it's not just God's sans time state. It's the variable in the sans time state that makes it discussable, intelligible in any sort of way to talk about this as some state in God rather than some state God never had. Okay, so now it's not just God in the sans time state, but it's God and the variable over that sans time state doing something. So even if you rule out the initial state, it's God and the index, whatever that is, combined, juxtaposed, that may be causing the thing. But it turns out that index, whatever it is accounting for God's free choices. Well, in God's free choices, you have his reasons for and against. You have the kind of nature of God, which would determine his reasons for and against. Also, how he adjudicates on the reasons for and against, how he chooses to act based on that adjudication. There's a whole bunch of things that could have been otherwise. Now you've got all these variables. And any way in which the world could have been otherwise, you now have confounding, because which one of the things in that reasoning process made the change the variable, right? That changed the outcome, the universe. This is why it's not just some filibuster that you want to avoid adding too many variables into a model. There's a practical concern of confounding that happens if you do this and you're just careless and you throw in the kitchen sink to see what happens. It turns out that you can't describe the change in terms of a few small components. You've got a bunch of tangling going on. And that's exactly what Oppy has been trying to make clear to Loke here. What work is the initial state's doing? And if it's doing work at all in the way that Loke wants it to do, how are you untangling all these things from the other things in which it should be doing work? How do you know which part of that there is actually making the thing that you want to say it's making? It's not entailed by your model. You have to post hoc just say it's the case that something's doing such and such, which two different people could look at the model and disagree, which is the last thing you want to have happen about a model. It should be clear. When there's an observational variable, you should be able to measure what affected what. Because if there's disagreement, now you have to have two different models of models based on which part of the model is doing the work. Well, on my interpretation of the model, which is itself a submodel, it's this one. And now you're multiplying models to account for the fact that you have too many variables, which is why you could have multiple ideas of the Kalam. You could also have multiple theistic models where the Kalam and Thomists disagree, because Thomists think that God's always timeless. So all those variables about God being in time and sans time, right? The Thomist would say, not even just the atheist, the Thomist would say, you've multiplied entities in God. There doesn't need to be these two states here. God timelessly does this, and that's that, right? So their model's more simple than Loke's model, and they would disagree for the same reasons. So I've seen people in like Capturing Christianity's comment section saying this is like filibustering. This is just like meta talk instead of getting to the point. This is the point. It's very important. So
Yeah, that's an interesting way of cashing out simplicity. I've been trying to figure out for a while now what motivates like applying Occam's razor here. Like what is the reason that we're doing it for? And I think your idea of confounding is pretty interesting. I think Draper takes the stance that it's more areas to be wrong. So if we have like one theory that has like only 2 commitments, and then one theory that has 4, 4 places to be wrong as opposed to 2, it's just better to err on the side of caution there.
exactly, yeah, that's another issue too.
But then there's also the other understanding, which is that having if you get one explanation, well, if you get the same explanation from both theories, but one has more stuff, right? It doesn't seem like that stuff is adding anything.
Yes.
Right. So it's also just we then recontextualize it in terms of explanatory power. So I don't really know where Oppy stands. It sounds like we have 3 positions, if I understand confounding. Just to be like trying to figure out what the commitments are doing in each of the theories and how they're interacting with things, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So that's pretty interesting. I will definitely have to research that more. Okay. So now we have our next clip, which is where Loke is going to state his property argument again. Let's go there.
You was
Yeah.
taking are all just things that I deny, right? Because that's the basic assumption in the theory.
So Graham is assuming that once you have the initial state, other things cannot begin to exist uncaused, right? Once you have the initial, he's assuming that. But I give 3 reasons to dispute the assumption, right? I say that because if the initial state itself begins to exist uncaused, there'll be nothing that makes a difference between the initial state and other things that comes later, right? Given my 3 reasons, right? So your assumption is wrong.
All right, so we kind of covered this issue. It's sort of repeating, but the reason I picked it was to show that he clearly doesn't understand the way Oppy is arguing. And the guys over at Real Atheology made a comment on on the original video of this debate. Well, I guess this is the original video. And they said, one of the reasons that Oppy is so good in these debates is because you have to get on his level and argue it against him, and most people don't do that. Either they don't understand, or they just they refuse to like engage in this type of arguing. But that's really the only way to like present issues to Oppy. And clearly Loke here in saying, "Hey, you're just assuming this to be the case." All right, that's not the matter in question right now. Oppy might have reasons for his believing, and he does, that he's expanded upon in his other papers, but it doesn't matter if he presents those reasons or not, because that's not how he conceives of arguments as working, right?
Right.
It's not just like, oh, just because you have reasons that you've explicitly detailed and I haven't, that you automatically win. We have to you'd have to present inconsistencies, in my view, with your arguments. I mean, you can hold your reasons and keep them to yourself, sure, but they're not giving me any reason to reject my theoretical framework or my worldview.
Right.
So
exactly, and again, to the more substantive point, Oppy is just reiterating his original argument. But as you and I pointed out already, his original argument was committing a category error in premise 1. So Oppy has no reason to listen to the 4th time or the 5th time or the 6th time. Loke just reasserts his argument as long as the first premise keeps committing the same category error. So,
yep, this is the big issue, and I think this is now where, as I was going through my debate notes, I was like, man, Loke is just really not getting it. He's very, very stubborn on this point.
yes.
So once you said that, I made sure to be aware, keep my eyes peeled for that, and it just became so explicitly clear, So, and in these clips that I selected, I cut out the majority of like this whole section is going to be just arguing about that issue. So,
Right.
that one issue. All right. Now we're going on to his theory of modality. He's just going to explain it real fast for us.
That in order for the individual states,
Okay,
to
yeah, got
be
it. Right.
special.
So the special property is necessity, right? Obtaining of necessity, existing of necessity. Necessity excludes alternatives. There's no problem, right? So where this comes from is thinking about modality and what's the best theory of metaphysical necessity. I think that the best theory of metaphysical necessity is one which says that every world shares some history with the actual world, diverges only because chances play out differently. I think that the reason for believing that is the same reason as there is for believing any other theory, that it's a kind of simplest theory that's adequate to all of the things that we really want to explain. So it turns out that the initial state precisely has the special property that you're looking for, one that excludes absolutely everything else, right? Because if things must be this way, they can't be any other way. So that's the first reply.
All right. Now, we've been talking about chance before. We talked about his theory of modality earlier, but
Yes.
We didn't cover chance. And that's kind of important because he doesn't want to end up saying, with like you were saying earlier, that he could very well end up in a position where he just has to say everything is necessary, and we lose all sense of modality there.
Right.
So the way he gets around that, the reason that we have different possible worlds, he's going to say is due to quantum mechanics. And so he's going to appeal to quantum indeterminacy. So I'm no physicist.
Neither am I.
Yeah. Ultimately, my brother, I should probably bring him in into the picture because he's studying physics right now. But the general idea is going to be something like this. I think it has to do with quantum tunneling. But certain like atoms or certain particles or quantum particles don't necessarily need the total energy required to like overcome a barrier. They can kind of not have like enough energy to jump over it, but sometimes they'll just appear on the other side. And there's no cause for why they all of a sudden just appear on the other side of the barrier, even though they didn't have enough energy to get over it. Instead, it's going to be, I guess on most interpretations, it's going to be cast in terms of probabilities. There's just a certain probability that this is going to happen, right? Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't, and there's no like explanation that we can appeal to for why this is the case other than just saying that, this is a potential, possibility. And so that's supposed to save him from having like a completely deterministic picture. Hopefully what I said, if you know anything about quantum indeterminacy, hopefully that matches up with what you think it is.
Yeah, I don't know too much about it, but even if Oppy didn't specify something about quantum mechanics, all Oppy has to do is bolt Tychism from like Charles Sanders Peirce's philosophy or something like that to his model, where there are no fixed laws. There's not like a fixed law of gravity. There's just something we've observed over time, but maybe there are subtle things under the hood changing the law that we would never observe in 10,000 years. It might take, hundreds of thousands of years for the gravitational constant to move, 1/100th of a decimal point or something like that. Something like that, where but Charles Sanders Peirce's idea, cynicism, where there are tiny continuous changes happening under the hood all the time, and tychism, they're happening randomly. And so if Oppy took a view like that and just let the causal history of the world just be very, very large, that alone would be the chance events, maybe the contingent events under our constants and laws did some way or some other way, and that would determine the alternate history. So even if he didn't have a particular view like quantum mechanics, there's definitely ways open to him that other philosophers have kicked around. So I'm happy with that.
Perfect. Yeah.
Oh, one thing I did want to note too is it was this comment he made here and his other comment that he made in the math debate with Craig that specifically got me on my S5 construction thing, right? Where he does specify that every possibility is just an alternate way an event in the causal history could have been, right? Juxtapose that with the fact that at t equals 0, nothing's happened yet, so there's no causal history to speak of. But his modality would still be present because there are ways it could be in the future. And so that's where I think at t equals 0, he's justified making the S5 move, where you have possible states the world could be if time moved, and those possible states are necessary. So that was actually it was this comment and the one like it in the Craig video that got me motivated on the S5 construction to begin with.
Interesting. Now that's also a point I want to investigate more. So I'll have to keep my eyes, because I wasn't really thinking in terms of that, because I don't have much expertise in logic, which is a very gentle way of saying that I don't know it at all, because I do continental philosophy, so logic is like some weird mystical art,
I hear that.
So, yeah. Interesting. Perfect. Okay. Any more comments on this section, or should we go to his...
We're good.
Cool. Now he's going to be moving on to explanations here and how he conceives of them, and we're going to have a response from Loke as well.
Between necessities, like if you can infer the necessity of one thing from the necessity of another thing, then in a certain sense you've got an explanation of its necessity, but you haven't got an explanation of why the things you inferred it from were necessary. And so I think that ultimately explanations of necessity are going to ground out in things that have no explanation. That will be where you stop with your explanation.
Yes, and where you stop, it can be by definition, right? So for example, the definition of something that has no beginning will be that it always exists. That's what it implies. And therefore, something that always exists implies that it exists necessarily, right? So it can stop with definition, right?
No,
that's
All right, that's that clip. Now this is interesting because I just recently decided I wanted to rewatch the Rob Koons debate with Oppy again, and Koons makes a point, I think, that essentially is similar to this, but it's also different. And Koons wanted to say that I think it was something like, an object's necessity can entail other necessary things. And then he was trying to ask, like, hey, if we had two theories and we have one necessary thing that entails a bunch of other necessary things, or one necessary thing, and then we have just a bunch of other necessary things that we just kind of have to posit, in like a brute manner. Which theory is going to be better? And then he was trying to say, Rob Koons was trying to say, it seems like it's going to be the entailment relation that's better, because you have to posit less entities overall, because they just kind of come bundled in with this bigger one. So that was an interesting point. I think now what we just witnessed here was something a little bit different, which was like this idea of like an explanation chain in terms of necessity. And so it's going to be, Oppy has this example of saying like, oh, like why is the Earth floating in space? And then and you just say like, I don't know, it just is. That's the way it has to be. And then some other dude comes and says, well, it's actually because it's sitting on an elephant that is floating in space. We haven't really moved anywhere with these two theories, right? Because then the next question is, why is it that the elephant is floating in space?
Yeah.
And you sort of just have to posit that. So it doesn't seem like we've moved anywhere in terms of like explaining necessity, right? We're still stuck here. So.
Yeah. That's right. And also an error that Loke makes. Well, I mean, it's not like a blatant error. I can't say it like that, but maybe a tactical error that Loke makes is when he says a definition of something necessarily existing is that it always exists. No. I mean, you can't. That's such an interesting, weird definition of necessity. I can't think of anybody else that uses that definition of necessity. Thomists don't use it because the universe could have always existed, but it's not necessary in any logical or metaphysical sense. Because what if the universe existed eternally, but it looked like A, versus existing eternally, but looked like B instead, right? So the way in which it exists might not be necessary. But also in metaphysical necessity, maybe the universe exists eternally, but it has an ontological dependence on like an Aristotelian motion of the prime mover that thinks itself, that moves the gears, which moves the universe, and that's why it exists the way it does. So it's not clear that either in metaphysical or logical necessity that you can just cash out in terms of things always existing. You could go back to the divine activist model of God and abstracta for another example. Like it's mathematical abstracta always exists, but they are caused by God's mental activity in some way. So I mean, there's all sorts of interesting ways where one might just disagree with the definition that aren't even atheistic motivations. The joke I always make is it looks like Loke is going to have this out with the theists, and then once they figure out what they decide, right, once they have their in-house debate, so we know exactly who we're arguing with, then they can bring it to everybody else, and then we'll see what came of that. But until then, it's like we're trying to argue with three different people saying three different contradictory things all at the same time, and we're expected to make something of this. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, exactly. I'm in total agreement with that. All right. Now our next clip is where Loke explicitly defines his understanding of necessity. So we can just run through this.
Necessarily, that's just invalid.
Well, by necessary, I mean that in this world it cannot fail to exist, right? So in this world it has no beginning, mean that it has always existed. So it doesn't. This means that it doesn't fail to exist. And so if something has no beginning and is unsustained, right, then it has it has always been this way, right, in this actual world. So this is based on what it means. Yeah.
So I think this is one of the issues that he's having is that he isn't distinguishing, just like the full array of all logical possibilities with like real possibilities in the way that Oppy and William Lane Craig are talking about it. And so,
Yeah.
He also gets into trouble because he's trying to say like, hey, you say your thing is necessary, but I think it could possibly not exist, right? I mean, I think Swinburne kind of takes this route. So I'm not going to say that it's the wrong thing, because Swinburne seems to be saying that God is contingent, but like only because he understands necessity, and that like, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case, right? Obviously, atheists don't think that God exists, so he wouldn't exist necessarily. So therefore, we end up with this sort of contingency. I don't want get Swinburne's view wrong though. So
Yeah, as I understand Swinburne's view, he says that God is metaphysically necessary but logically contingent, and that denying his existence doesn't seem to produce like a formal contradiction.
yes, that's a way better way of putting it. I probably misspoke.
Oh no, I think you're just fine. I just wanted to just unpack it and make it clear, so you and the audience would see it and go, oh yeah, it's exactly what it was.
Yeah, perfect. So I don't want to jump at his idea of necessity, but I think he's not on Oppy's. What you have to do when you're arguing with Oppy, you have to adopt the terms that he's using with his worldview, right, in the same way that he does it with theists, right? He doesn't say like, hey, that's the wrong idea of necessity that you have. I have the right one. He comes at you.
Yeah, as Jack would say, that's just equivocating on value. Yeah. The other thing to note too is under Loke's own definition of necessity, it's not clear that God has libertarian free will. And I actually just thought of this while thinking about this, right? If we define the actual world as the world in which God made decisions X, Y, Z, whatever, to create the world as it is, well, could God have done otherwise while still calling it the actual world? I mean,
could God have... Sorry, go for it.
Oh no, I was just saying. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to repeat the question. Could God have done otherwise with and still call it the actual world? Yeah. What, right. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, well, what is the actual world, right? We're going to have to define what we mean by actual world if that's pivotal to Loke's definition, right? But if it turns out that the actual world is just the world in which God did decide X, Y, Z, and that's why the world is the way it is, then if God would have made a different decision, would we still be talking about the actual world?
Okay. I think I'm following.
And so because the actual world is the way that God chose to make it, then as long as we're talking about the actual world, we always have to be talking about the world in which God made the decisions to make the world this way. Else you're just not talking about the actual world anymore, right?
Yeah.
And so on this view, God acted necessarily by Loke's definition. But to have free will, the most minimal definition of libertarian free will I've heard. I was arguing with Mickey in the comments until I decided to stop arguing with Mickey in the comments. It was an absolute waste of my time. But taking that minimal definition, God has to be the source of his actions. God has to act on the basis of reasons, and the act has to be contingent. Well, on Loke's definition, if it turns out the act is necessary, because if you're talking about a world in which God made different decisions, it's not the actual world. And his definition of necessity just means always is the case if you're talking about the actual world, then it fails the third horn that you need for free will. So God wouldn't have libertarian free will if that's the definition of necessity he's going to use.
Yeah. And this is not even getting into divine simplicity either, and the issues there.
Right. This is just a problem that Loke brought on himself by using this weird definition.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's a train wreck right now.
Yes.
So here, let's move on to Loke's understanding of libertarian free will.
Oh wow! Didn't even realize that was the next section. That worked out perfect.
It does, doesn't it? All right. Yes, this is the point.
What that premise is there just one premise that's crucial there, or are there many?
Yeah, there are a few actually. Yeah. So from the causal principle, right, which shows that everything that begins to exist has a cause, right? From that causal principle, which is based on those three reasons which I offered, one can and the reasons why I offered those is because, as I said, right, there's our universe. So I've given those reasons. So based on the causal principle, what this implies is that the first cause has no beginning, right? And so this implies that the first cause it's not an event, because an event is something that has a beginning, right? So the first cause is not a change, right? So what it means is that the first cause must be initially changeless, right? And so an initially changeless first cause, for the initially changeless first cause to change and bring about an event, the initially changeless first cause must have, firstly, the capacity to bring about an event in a way that is not that is not determined by prior events, right? And it must also have the capacity to prevent itself from changing initially, right? So that it is not so that it can be initially changeless and beginningless, right? And these two properties implies that the first cause has libertarian freedom, right? It must be able to freely bring about the first event. And anything that has libertarian freedom is a personal agent, and therefore the first cause is a personal agent.
All right, you want to take a go at this?
I'll do my best. So,
Yeah.
I mean, we've went over a plethora of problems with this, right? You've got timelessness and omniscience. You've got omnipotence and the Mill-Bilgrami objection. You've got Loke's definition of necessity. You've got the problem of timelessness, whereas did God actually make a decision to stop being timeless and enter into time? Well, if there's no temporal events, right? There's no event in which God actually decided anything. It's empty, right? Unless Loke gives it some extension, which then he falls into Graham's trap. So good luck with that, soldier. But I mean, let's suppose the theist just thought those were technical objections, or not even a theist, because theists disagree with this argument too. But let's suppose a Kalam proponent thought that these are just over technical, jargony objections. Give me an intuition. Okay, here's an intuition. Could God have chosen, right, not to be in time? Right? Could God have chosen to remain timeless if remain has no duration? So God fails to choose to be in time. God fails to choose to be in time again. God fails to choose to be in time again, right? Let's suppose you have 20,000 repeats of this, then 20,001th of this. God chooses to be in time. What happens to those first 20,000 items on the list? Well, there's no events in a sans time dimension. So they go poof, and the event in which God actually comes in time goes poof, because it's not actually an event that causes it, because there's no in-time event to speak of. All we know is God wasn't and then he was. It's not even like that. It's not and then he was, because at no time, right, did he fail to be in time. So that was never given any extensionality. So if God could have freely chosen otherwise, it never would have shown up in the sans time dimension Loke's talking about, because there are no events on record in that dimension. So the only event at all of which anybody, including God, should have any awareness is that he's no longer in the sans time dimension, and that's it. So could God have freely chosen not to be? Well, if he did, and he reneged on that decision, we'd never know about it, because no recorded events would happen. So his model doesn't support the alternative. So what are you to make of any of this?
Yeah, I mean, free will is dicey anyway.
Yeah.
But then this idea of, because William Lane Craig tries to make a similar argument where like God was outside of time, and then he chose to be in time, and it was simultaneous with the creation of time.
Yes.
But that's like a temporal relation, right? As you were pretty much saying. So that doesn't make any sense. And then Draper says that you can't. He is convinced that you can't understand causality without temporality anyway. So he would probably be pretty skeptical at the idea of like we have some extended duration in which God exists, and he's like making these decisions to not, move out of this state of changelessness. So yeah, I don't know. I just there's just way too many problems here for me to be happy with this kind of response.
Exactly.
So, all right, now we're going to get into this distinction between objects and events, because it's somewhat, well, yeah.
Back to beginnings, they're kind of equally placed, whether they have to have them or not.
Yeah, so I think to answer your question, we have to be clear about what do we mean by events, right? What's the definition of an event, right? So as I said earlier on my view, an event is equivalent to a change, right? So what is a change? A change is involves the gaining or the losing of properties, right? Something or part of the thing gaining or losing a property. And so at the state of gain a property or lose a property, that state, right, will be a beginning, right? As something gain a property, it begins to have a new property. So, and therefore, on this definition, events have beginning, right? Whereas an object does not necessarily have beginnings, because that could be say an initially changeless object, right? An object that is initially changeless will not have a beginning. It has, yeah. So that's the distinction.
All right, thoughts on this?
I mean, this I think is one of the central sources of confusion.
Yep.
Loke seems to be saying that just by definition of what he means by an event is that an event is kind of like a record of when an object gains or loses something. So let's say I grow 6 feet taller, no, 2 inches taller, something like that, right? The event would be the record of my change, is how Oppy seems to be, or Loke, sorry, seems to be cashing out events. Well, given that Oppy wants to say that his initial state is an event, obviously the way that Oppy is defining it as an event is distinct from the way that Loke is defining it as an event. So Loke's going to say, well, you know, the initial state of the universe can't be an event, but he's using a different definition of event than Oppy is. So all Oppy has to do here is say, okay, I agree it can't be an event under your definition, but here's what I mean by an event, and here's why my initial state's an event. So what do you call my thing, and how does that relate to your first cause status?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. It doesn't seem like we can really situate Oppy's idea of like this initial state within Loke's sort of setup. I mean, he does give a definition of state as well later on. But it doesn't seem readily apparent, because part of the issue is that he wants to implement this idea of changelessness into everything.
Yes.
So he's trying to cut off Oppy's, like, you know, I don't know, the path that Oppy wants to go down, but it's not at all like cogent nor sufficient to do so.
No, it's just on my definition, the first thing can't be an event. And Graham's just like, well, that's just not what I meant by an event. So,
Yep. We're talking about two different things here. So, perfect. And then this is naturally going to lead into the idea of Cambridge change.
Yes.
So let's have Oppy explain that.
Right. As to whether something, yeah.
So it's quite common for people to distinguish between real change and Cambridge change, and for people to think that if that merely persisting through time is just Cambridge change, it's not real change. Right? And likewise, changes in your location relative to the location of other things because they're moving, right? That's just a Cambridge change. It's not a real change. So,
all right.
Yeah. So this talk of Cambridge change is important not just for atheists and the Kalam and things like this, but the most I've seen this discussed is Thomists and their arguments. So bringing this back to like a theistic example to back up what Oppy is saying here to show this isn't like atheistic filibustering. There are theistic models that have these tools. Let's suppose that the universe did begin to exist in a Thomist model, right? So there was no universe, and then Big Bang happens, a bunch of cosmic events happen, change, and there's a universe, right? Well, the usual objection is, well, wait a second. You want God to be timeless. You want God to have no unactualized potentials, right? So in God is the potential to actualize this universe that's now come into being, and the potential not to do so. And he's now actualized one of those potentials. So how do you square that with God's pure act? How do you square that with God's being changeless? Didn't he change himself when he went from not creating a universe to creating a universe? What's up with that? And the Thomist response is to say that God didn't change at all. God is the same God he's always been. God's doing the same thing he's always doing, right? And being, in some regard, emanates from God. The being changes as being does, and things change around God. Universes come into and maybe even out of and into being again. It could be a cyclical universe model. God's the center of it, but God's just doing the same thing God always does, and things change around God. So they would say that all that has changed in universes coming into out of being around God is a Cambridge relation, right? So there's a Cambridge change in which God's doing whatever he was doing, and now there's a universe sustained by God, and that's like an implicit relation there between God and the universe. And if the universe fails to be anymore for whatever reason, gets sucked into a black hole, who knows? Now there's not this universe sustained by God. God's still sustaining all of being. It just so happens that in this being constantly sustained by God via his timeless actions, there comes to be and fails to be universes, let's say. So that's the Thomistic idea of Cambridge change. So it's not just Oppy's thing here. He's not pulling a rabbit out of his hat. This is a theistic model too. And so what Oppy's trying to get at here is, so let's back this up a minute. Before this clip, Loke is trying to say that in order to be changeless, you can't enter into time at all, right? There's no time to speak of at all, because if you're in time, you can't help but change. Implicit in this, I think, is that time is a measure of change. I kind of see what Loke is saying here, right? And this actually, I'm actually going to have to play defense on Loke one time. I didn't think I'd be able to do it, but I think I'm going to be able to pull this off. Let's see how this goes. Okay. So remember how Oppy was talking about the distinction between like the absence of distance whatsoever and a distance of zero, the left out discussion. It's one thing to say that there's a change of zero, i.e., we're measuring time as if we expect a change, and the thing being measured is just coming up zero, like a thermometer or something. That would still be change on Loke's view. It's just a change of zero. It's a zero change, but time is still measuring a change, because on Loke's view, that's what time does. Time is a sequence of befores and afters that's meant to measure changes between temporal states. And so even if nothing changes throughout time, it's still a change. It's just a zero measured change. So I think what Oppy is what Loke is trying to say. And so what Loke is saying is the only way for something to be changeless, i.e. absent any notion of change whatsoever, not just a merely zero change, not just a merely zero distance, but the absence of any change whatsoever, is to remove time from the equation, because time is a thing that measures change. I think that's what Loke is trying to say here, as charitably as I can represent that. And so what Oppy is saying is, well, but if you take a higher resolution view and you look at, if you distinguish between, say, Cambridge changes and intrinsic changes, right? You can have God be changed, God enter into Cambridge change over time, like the Thomists would say, without God intrinsically changing in his own being and his ontology over time, as the Thomists would say. And so the Thomists would say that, time revolves around God always, but God is timeless always, because he's not entering into any ontological change, no matter what else is the case temporally. And so I think Oppy is just trying to gently say to Loke, there are other models. You can actually make this distinction without using this kind of weird definition of changeless. Because most people hear the idea of change, they just think no change. But Loke is trying to say the absence of any idea of change whatsoever, not even zero change.
Yeah, that's that feels like it's going to be the big issue here, and they unfortunately aren't able to explore it.
Yeah.
for much longer because the debate kind of closes out, and so I would have liked to have heard a little bit more of that. But I mean, ultimately, I think my intuitions lie with the idea that like it's a little weird trying to fit Cambridge change into like this larger picture of change anyway. And Oppy, I think, agrees with that because he at one point he eventually just says like there's a reason this distinction came to be. It was you were trying to distinguish change from this other sort of thing. So
yeah, and it goes back to the example I gave with the videotape with the children running around in the statue, right? If you stop the videotape and say, look, the statue's not changing, of course it's paused. And if you show no videotape whatsoever and say, look, in the absence of any recorded events, there's a statue here that's not changing, people are going to look at you like you're stupid. The only time it makes sense to talk about whether or not there is change, i.e. changelessness or change, is let the video recording play and see what the statue does. That's just what we understand to be the case. So
yeah, exactly. Perfect. All right. Do you have any, final words, any closing thoughts you want to get out? Or did we talk it all out?
I think we bludgeoned this to death. I think there's no longer a dead horse to beat. I think we're looking at a pile of glue.
I would agree. We went longer than the actual debate itself. We did 2 hours and 51 minutes. So
that's nuts.
Yep.
It was a lot of fun, though.
It was. I think we got out some really good, interesting stuff out of this. So there was like, even though their disagreement kind of like stalled the debate for a really long period of time, there was like a lot of really complex things that were working behind the scenes.
Yes.
That were going into this. So I think it was kind of necessary to untangle that piece by piece. So yeah. Well, if you don't have any closing words, then I will just end the broadcast. So thanks to all the listeners who survived this. If you want to see the video version of this, then you can find my YouTube channel. So I guess I probably should have said at the beginning. It's going to go on podcast. But anyway, that's it. Thanks for listening. All right.